Before the engines of progress ever roared, before the glow of electric light touched the streets of London, there was a quiet dawn, a moment when the world stood still, waiting for the rise of a queen who would shape an entire century. Tonight we drift back to that time, the age of candlelight and steam, of whispered courtrooms and sprawling empires. The story you're about to hear is not of power and conquest, but of time itself, how one life became the still heart of an era that would change everything. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, settle in, breathe slowly, and let's begin with the dawn of the Victorian era. In the gentle stillness of a spring morning in 1819, Kensington Palace stirred with the hushed activity of attendants preparing for a birth that few thought would matter beyond courtly gossip. The air was damp with the faint scent of lilacs from the palace gardens, the kind of soft fragrance that clings to memory more than to fabric. Within a chamber of muted candlelight, a child entered the world, Alexandrina Victoria, daughter of Edward, Duke of Kent and Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Her first cries belonged not to the sound of empire, but to the quiet breath of domestic life. At that moment, no one imagined that this small child, fifth in line to the throne, would come to rule over a quarter of the Earth's population. Her father, the Duke of Kent, was the fourth son of George III, not the heir, nor the heir's heir. Yet fate, as history would prove, has a way of clearing the path for the unexpected. Victoria's infancy unfolded beneath the grand yet melancholy ceilings of Kensington Palace. The palace itself was neither the largest nor the most magnificent of royal residences. It had the air of genteel seclusion, a place where echoes softened and time seemed to pause. Its corridors were long and pale, its windows tall and draughty, and its gardens orderly, but often shrouded in morning mist. In those gardens, nurses wheeled her carriage along gravel paths where dew clung to every blade of grass, and the world beyond the hedges remained distant, as if history itself was holding its breath. When Victoria was scarcely a year old, her father died suddenly of pneumonia. The loss transformed the atmosphere of her childhood. The widowed Duchess of Kent, left with limited income and a child of unexpected significance, withdrew further from the royal court. Within the palace, a system was devised, later called the Kensington system, meant to protect and control the young princess, to shield her from what her mother viewed as the corrupting influences of other royal relatives. It was a regimen of isolation, discipline, and constant supervision. Victoria's days were carefully measured, lessons at appointed hours, walks always in the company of her mother or a governess, and no companions of her own age. Even play was structured, gentle, and observed. The curtains of her nursery filtered the sunlight into soft amber, and the ticking of the mantel clock marked time with relentless precision. Outside, the early industrial revolution was reshaping Britain, steam engines beginning to pull carriages, factory chimneys rising where fields once stretched, yet within the palace walls, life followed an older rhythm, bound by decorum and silence. Her education was earnest and exacting. She studied languages, history, geography, and scripture under the guidance of private tutors and her devoted German governess, Baroness Leysen. The Baroness became one of the few people whom Victoria trusted completely. In the quiet hours of study, surrounded by neatly stacked books and the faint scent of wax and paper, the princess's mind grew keen and orderly. She developed a sense of responsibility that outpaced her years, perhaps because solitude leaves much room for reflection. The Kensington system dictated that she should never walk down a staircase without holding someone's hand, never be left alone, and never meet guests unsupervised. What was meant to protect her instead deepened her awareness of confinement. Even as a child, she began to keep notes, brief observations about those around her, about her mother's moods, about the stillness of the rooms. These early reflections revealed a sharp and independent nature quietly forming beneath restraint. Outside her world of tutors and corridors, Britain itself was uneasy. The 1820s and 1830s were decades of unrest and transformation. Cities grew dark with smoke. Factories consumed long hours of human labor. Reformers spoke in hushed gatherings about voting rights and social change. The nation's heartbeat was quickening toward modernity, yet its future monarch spent her days tracing Latin verbs and sketching family trees in the margins of her exercise books. By the time Victoria was 10, she understood something of her position. A family tree, shown to her by a tutor, revealed that she stood next in line to inherit the throne after her uncles, all childless. That revelation changed her quietly. In later years she would recall that moment as the first time she felt solemn and serious. From then on, the lessons carried greater weight. Every correction, every instruction felt like preparation for something immense, though distant. Her mother's ambitions and the manipulative influence of Sir John Conroy, her mother's advisor, strained the household. He sought to control both mother and daughter, positioning himself as indispensable. The Duchess supported his schemes, believing that through him she could share authority if Victoria ever became queen. The young princess, however, grew to distrust him deeply. Their relationship would later define her earliest acts as monarch, to free herself from his reach. But those years of constraint were not without gentler memories. Victoria found solace in art, music, and her small dog, Dash, a spaniel given to her by her governess. She loved the rhythms of nature beyond the palace gates, the stillness after rain, the flicker of sunlight on water. She kept sketchbooks filled with careful drawings of trees and distant hills, perhaps dreaming of freedom that seemed forever postponed. In the quiet of her room, the air thick with the faint aroma of coal smoke drifting from London, Victoria would write small notes in her journal, a habit that would stay with her for life. They were simple at first, the weather, the books she read, the people she saw, yet even in those early entries, one can sense a mind observing rather than merely existing, the detached curiosity of someone preparing, unknowingly, to rule. As the 1830s approached, illness and age thinned the ranks of her uncles. One by one, they died without heirs, and the path cleared until only William I remained. He was aging without surviving children, and the kingdom began to look toward Kensington. Courtiers whispered, politicians speculated, and the Duchess of Kent drew the curtains a little tighter, protecting her daughter from what she called worldly excitement. Yet outside the palace, the world was already changing in her name. The newspapers began to print cautious speculations about the young princess. The people, weary of scandal among older royals, imagined hope in her innocence and education. The quiet corridors of Kensington no longer seemed so remote from the pulse of the realm, and so the girl grew, poised unknowingly between childhood and sovereignty, between the last stillness of the old world and the restless stirrings of a new century. Each day carried her a little closer to the morning when messengers would ride to the palace gates and history would softly open its door. As the morning light began to seep through the high windows of Kensington Palace, the quiet life of the young princess was poised on the edge of irrevocable change. The long corridors, once so filled with measured steps and whispered instructions, were about to witness the subtle stirrings of history. William I, her uncle, had been ill, his reign nearing its natural conclusion, and the kingdom waited with patient expectation for the next sovereign. In the stillness of her chambers, Victoria, now 18, remained unaware of the exact gravity of what was approaching, yet the world beyond her palace walls was already shifting in anticipation. On June 20th, 1837, the message arrived with the precise solemnity of a courtly protocol. William I had died, and Alexandrina Victoria, Princess of Kent, was now Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The news travelled quickly through the halls of Kensington, through the winding streets of London, and into the hearts of ministers, courtiers, and subjects alike. The transition of power, so long confined to discussions of lineage and duty within her private studies, now manifested as a tangible reality. In that moment, Victoria's life transformed from the protective enclosure of childhood into the vast, imposing responsibilities of monarchy. The early days of her reign were marked by an almost tangible mixture of awe and restraint. Victoria, accustomed to the ordered routines of the Kensington system, was suddenly surrounded by an intricate web of political and ceremonial expectations. Courtiers moved with a careful choreography, ministers whispered in an austere formality, and the ministers of state, each carrying their own agendas and loyalties, observed the young queen with polite caution. It was a somber atmosphere, a world of soft but deliberate steps, of measured voices, and of the constant awareness that every gesture, every decision, could resonate far beyond the palace walls. Victoria's education, once limited to languages, history, and moral instruction, was now pressed into practical service. She met with her new advisors, listened to discussions on domestic and foreign affairs, and began to learn the delicate art of governance under the watchful guidance of experienced ministers. Though her youth might have suggested fragility, there was a deliberate steadiness in her approach. She asked questions, made notes, and gradually began to assert a quiet authority that distinguished her from the passive role her predecessors had often occupied. The transition from sheltered daughter to sovereign was not instantaneous, but it was profound, a careful awakening to a world whose scale far exceeded the rooms and gardens of Kensington. Her first meetings with members of the government carried a weight that only grew with each passing day. Lord Melbourne, her first Prime Minister, became a crucial figure in this delicate initiation. He guided her through the intricacies of parliamentary procedure, the nuances of legislation, and the subtleties of foreign diplomacy. In his presence, Victoria discovered the dual nature of monarchy, the visible symbol of unity for her subjects, and the careful, strategic presence behind the closed doors of governance. Every decision, however minor it might seem to the unobservant eye, held significance for the kingdom, and the young queen learned to navigate this new reality with a combination of observation and quiet confidence. At the same time, Victoria was adapting to the immense ceremonial aspects of her role. Public appearances, audiences with diplomats, and the formalities of court life required her to maintain an unbroken composure. The transition from private to public life was striking. No longer confined to her chambers or to the careful routine of her youth, she now represented continuity, stability, and authority to millions across the British Isles. Every gesture, from the tilt of her head to the measured cadence of her voice, was observed and interpreted by those who had vested interests in the kingdom's future. In these first days, Victoria learned the profound impact of presence, the quiet power of poised observation, and the subtle ways in which influence could be exerted without overt assertion. The country, in turn, was adjusting to its new queen. Newspapers, though more restrained than the modern press, recorded her accession with a combination of reverence and cautious optimism. The public, aware of the youth of their sovereign, watched with measured curiosity, aware that this quiet, educated princess would soon serve as the symbol of a nation increasingly restless under the pressures of industrial and social change. London's streets, often crowded and noisy, seemed to pause in reflection, as if the city itself recognized the delicate shift in authority. Across the countryside, the steady rhythm of rural life continued, yet conversations in towns and villages acknowledged the presence of a young queen who would guide Britain through an era yet unimagined. Even within the palace, the transformation of Victoria's identity was evident. She moved through rooms once familiar as a child with a newfound consciousness of her surroundings. The corridors were no longer solely corridors of measured childhood, but passages through which history itself now passed. Portraits of ancestors, previously mere decorations, became reminders of legacy and responsibility. Every tapestry, every piece of furniture carried stories of power and continuity. In this environment, Victoria began to shape not only her understanding of authority, but also her sense of self as both individual and symbol. In these first months, the young queen's reflections were silent but profound. Her diaries reveal a mind absorbing the enormity of her position with both determination and careful contemplation. She observed the dynamics of those around her, understood the expectations of her ministers, and noted the delicate balances of influence and tradition. In the measured quiet of her private rooms, she considered the meaning of reign, the burdens of duty, and the subtle ways in which the character of a ruler could guide a nation without overt assertion of power. The coronation, which would follow a few months later, was still weeks away, but the sense of responsibility was immediate. Every morning brought new audiences, every evening required thoughtful reflection. Victoria's days became long and structured, echoing the rhythms of her childhood, yet now infused with purpose and consequence. The transition from princess to monarch was complete in the eyes of the kingdom, though she continued to grow into the full awareness of her authority with each passing day. By the end of that first year, Victoria had begun to establish her presence as queen with subtle but unmistakable confidence. She balanced respect for tradition with her own emerging understanding of governance, observing, learning, and gradually asserting herself in the quiet manner that would characterize much of her early reign. The young queen's life, once confined to the muted corridors of Kensington, now unfolded on a stage that spanned an entire empire. And as London's streets stirred with the ordinary rhythm of life, carriages rolling over cobblestones, the faint tolling of church bells marking hours, shopkeepers arranging wares, Victoria's awareness of the broader world deepened. She was no longer merely a daughter under protective care. She was a sovereign whose decisions would ripple through cities, towns, and colonies, shaping the lives of countless subjects. The weight of monarchy was heavy, yet she bore it with measured grace, the quiet determination of one who had been prepared, unknowingly, for this moment since her earliest days. From this moment, the sheltered corridors of Kensington became a memory of what had been, a backdrop against which a new era was emerging. The young queen, with her diaries, her tutors, and her ministers, had begun the subtle work of defining what her reign would be. One guided by both reflection and responsibility, poised between tradition and the gradual march of change. It was the beginning of a transformation, not only for Victoria herself, but for the nation that would come to bear her name as the embodiment of its spirit, its progress, and its enduring identity. As the young queen moved through the responsibilities of her early reign, a subtle emptiness lingered in the spaces between her ceremonial duties. While the corridors of Buckingham Palace carried the echoes of her authority, the quieter chambers, the still gardens, and the moments after the audiences often felt solitary, despite the flurry of advisors, ministers, and courtiers. It was within this measured solitude that the presence of Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha began to assert its influence, not as a public spectacle, but as a private stabilizing force in the life of a sovereign whose world had expanded beyond imagination. The meeting of Victoria and Albert was not marked by instantaneous passion, but by the steady unfolding of understanding and respect. Albert, the son of Ernest I, Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, had been introduced into the royal sphere as a cousin and a well-educated, thoughtful young man of refined taste. Their correspondence and meetings revealed mutual interests in art, music, and scholarship, and over time, the Queen came to recognize in him a companion whose intellect complemented her own and whose temperament could temper the demands of courtly life. The marriage, solemnized on February 10, 1840, at the Chapel Royal of St. James's Palace, was conducted with the quiet dignity befitting their station. The ceremony reflected not only a union of two people, but a careful alignment of political and familial ties. Within the calm atmosphere of the chapel, with candles flickering softly against the gilded walls and the muted hum of an organ filling the space, Victoria and Albert exchanged vows that were witnessed by relatives and dignitaries, yet felt intimate in their essence. The union was a melding of minds as much as of crowns, an arrangement that would define not only personal life, but the contours of governance, art, and social influence throughout the decades to come. In the days that followed the wedding, the young queen and her consort began the delicate work of establishing a domestic life that balanced the demands of monarchy with private harmony. Their apartments, modest by royal standards but suffused with personal touches, became a space of study, reflection, and shared interest. Albert, deeply engaged with matters of design, science, and social improvement, offered perspectives that complemented Victoria's keen understanding of political and ceremonial responsibilities. Together they observed the subtle rhythms of their household, From the management of staff to the arrangement of state functions, each action executed with thoughtfulness and quiet precision. The harmony of their domestic life was further strengthened by shared pursuits. Music often filled the drawing rooms, Albert's compositions blending with Victoria's piano playing, creating a soothing backdrop to evenings otherwise consumed by the planning of public duties. Art, literature, and scientific observation became intertwined with conversation, the couple exchanging reflections on the works of contemporary thinkers, explorers, and inventors. This private cultivation of intellect and taste fostered a companionship that went beyond traditional roles of monarch and consort, creating a foundation of mutual respect that would endure through decades of shared governance and personal trials. Politically, Albert's influence was equally measured yet profound. He became an advisor and confidant, not in the manner of dictating policy, but through steady counsel, careful analysis, and a calm demeanor that complemented Victoria's decisive yet reflective approach. He observed the workings of Parliament, the nuances of diplomacy, and the subtle expectations of the royal household, offering insight without overshadowing the Queen's sovereignty. Together, they created a partnership in which ideas could be exchanged freely, decisions weighed carefully, and strategy was informed as much by intellect as by tradition. Their marriage also had a subtle cultural impact. Prince Albert's interest in the arts and sciences, combined with Victoria's appreciation for beauty and moral virtue, influenced the broader court and inspired initiatives that reached beyond the palace walls. Exhibitions, collections, and architectural projects reflected the couple's shared values, creating spaces in which public admiration and private satisfaction coexisted. Within these initiatives, one can discern the quiet shaping of an era in which taste, morality, and progress were intertwined, not through grand declarations but through sustained, deliberate cultivation. The early years of their marriage were marked by both joy and the slow accumulation of responsibility. The births of their children introduced rhythms of domestic care alongside the demands of monarchy. Each child's arrival brought private happiness, but also the careful orchestration of education, ceremonial duties, and the management of court expectations. Victoria and Albert navigated these challenges with measured devotion, creating a household in which affection, intellectual engagement, and moral instruction were interwoven. Their home, though part of the public eye, became a sanctuary where the pressures of governance could be mitigated by the certainty of shared values and mutual understanding. As their domestic life flourished, the broader political and social context of Britain continued its quiet transformation. Industrialization pressed forward, cities grew, and the empire extended its reach across distant continents. Within this expanding world, the marriage of Victoria and Albert offered a stabilizing contrast, a constant, measured presence amidst the rapid and often chaotic evolution of society. Their partnership became a model, consciously or unconsciously, for the integration of private virtue and public duty, a template that influenced both aristocratic norms and public perception of monarchy. Victoria's journals from this period reveal a profound sense of contentment and purpose, tempered by awareness of her duties. Albert, with his methodical approach and commitment to study, reinforced this perspective, encouraging the Queen to blend personal satisfaction with the demands of public life. Together they attended to matters of state, engaged with artists and scientists, and maintained the careful decorum that defined the court. Yet, beyond ceremony, they nurtured a deep companionship. Quiet conversations in shadowed corridors, walks in the palace gardens at dusk, and evenings of reflection that strengthened the personal bond underlying their public partnership. Over time, the influence of their union extended subtly into the broader governance of the empire. Albert took particular interest in education, industrial exhibitions, and social reform, offering guidance that was often unspoken but always considered. The Queen, receptive to his counsel, incorporated these perspectives into her own understanding of rulership. Their domestic harmony thus became inseparable from the intellectual and moral tone of the monarchy itself, a union that shaped not only their private lives, but the character of Victorian Britain at large. By the late 1840s, the quiet, ordered life of Victoria and Albert had become both a personal sanctuary and a cornerstone of national stability. Their home, whether at Buckingham Palace or Windsor, was a site where duty and affection coexisted, where private study and public ceremony interwove, and where the pressures of sovereignty were mitigated by mutual support. The calm devotion they cultivated, though unspoken in its dramatic intensity, radiated through the structures of governance, culture, and social expectation. As years passed, this union would demonstrate its enduring significance. It was a partnership that navigated grief, political controversy, and the expanding complexities of empire, all while maintaining the rhythms of domestic life and the cultivation of intellect, art, and science. The quiet, consistent presence of Albert beside Victoria provided both personal comfort and public steadiness, ensuring that the young Queen's reign, though marked by vast responsibilities, retained a human, measured quality. And as the royal couple moved through the decade, the harmonious blending of affection, intellect, and duty quietly set the tone for the decades to come. The empire, the nation, and the world beyond would watch, often unaware of the subtle foundations being laid in the corridors and gardens of Windsor and Buckingham. In this calm partnership, the seeds of a century's character, its moral ethos, its attention to refinement, and its measured embrace of progress were being sown, layer by careful layer, in the steady rhythm of daily life. As the years of Victoria and Albert's union unfolded, the palaces of Britain gradually transformed into spaces that were not only centres of authority, but also of domestic intimacy and moral cultivation. The quiet halls of Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and later Osborne House began to resonate with the soft sounds of children's laughter, the measured cadence of lessons, and the delicate rhythms of daily court life. Each room, once solely devoted to ceremony and stately purpose, now accommodated both the solemnity of monarchy and the tender rhythms of family life, illustrating the intricate weaving of public and private spheres that would define the Victorian era. Victoria's role as mother emerged with the same dedication and discipline that had characterized her approach to sovereignty. The couple had 9 children over a span of nearly 20 years, each birth carefully managed within the clinical and ceremonial protocols of the time. The arrival of each child was not merely a private event, but an occasion observed with solemnity by both the court and the public. The Queen and her consort approached each addition to the family with meticulous planning, attentive care, and an awareness of the moral and symbolic significance these young lives carried for the nation. In this way, the royal household became a model of domestic virtue, setting a standard for behaviour, education, and family cohesion that echoed throughout Britain. The upbringing of the children followed the deliberate patterns established in Victoria's own childhood, albeit tempered by lessons learned from the isolation of her youth. Tutors were appointed for languages, history, music, and moral instruction, ensuring that the young princes and princesses were prepared not only for their individual lives, but also for the responsibilities that came with proximity to the throne. Yet within these structured lessons, Albert and Victoria instilled a sense of warmth, affection, and attentiveness that softened the rigidity of formal education. Gardens, drawing rooms, and libraries became arenas of quiet exploration, where children could observe, question, and learn, enveloped in the steady guidance of parents who were both sovereigns and caretakers. Court life itself adapted to accommodate the rhythms of family. Audiences, formal ceremonies, and official duties were balanced with domestic routines that emphasized stability and order. The presence of children at certain functions introduced an element of human warmth into spaces previously dominated by austere formality. Through these subtle integrations, the royal household projected an image of moral propriety and family cohesion that resonated far beyond palace walls. Observers, from courtiers to the broader public, perceived in these displays a reflection of values that would define Victorian culture: devotion to duty, respect for hierarchy, and the sanctity of family life. The rituals of daily life were executed with careful attention to detail. Meal times, morning walks, and study sessions were observed with punctuality and consistency, emphasizing both discipline and the quiet cultivation of character. Albert, with his methodical nature, took a keen interest in the arrangement of these routines, ensuring that the household functioned with the efficiency of both a domestic environment and an institution of governance. Victoria, balancing her role as sovereign with that of mother, oversaw these arrangements with sensitivity, ensuring that ceremonial obligations did not overshadow the private needs of the family. Together, they created an atmosphere in which the palace itself became an exemplar of measured order, moral integrity, and personal care. Beyond the walls of the palace, the significance of Victoria and Albert's family life reverberated through British society. The image of a devoted queen and a conscientious consort raising their children with care and attentiveness provided a model for domestic ideals that influenced both the aristocracy and the emerging middle classes. Portraits, illustrated publications, and accounts in newspapers and journals emphasized these values, portraying the royal household as a moral compass for the nation. This quiet cultural influence, though subtle, helped codify expectations regarding family, parenting, and personal conduct during an era marked by rapid social, industrial, and urban change. In addition to moral instruction, the children's education fostered an awareness of international relations and global responsibilities. From an early age, the royal offspring were introduced to the notion that their lives were intertwined with the broader empire, that their presence in public ceremonies, diplomatic visits, and charitable endeavors carried significance beyond mere personal development. Albert, in particular, emphasized the importance of understanding different cultures, observing industry and science, and appreciating the moral responsibilities inherent in privilege. These principles, quietly instilled within the domestic sphere, extended the influence of family life into the realm of governance and empire. The palace gardens, with their carefully maintained landscapes, became a sanctuary not only for the queen and her consort but also for their children. Here, amid the symmetry of hedges, fountains, and flower beds, the young princes and princesses could play, explore, and observe nature under the gentle supervision of their parents. Walks at dusk, afternoons of quiet reflection, and lessons conducted in the open air reinforced the values of observation, patience, and attention to detail. The interplay between the natural world and structured learning mirrored the broader Victorian ideals of harmony between discipline and personal growth, between public duty and private cultivation. Ceremonial life, though often perceived as rigid and formal, was also infused with these familial rhythms. The arrival of the children for audiences or public appearances introduced moments of human warmth that softened the solemnity of monarchy. Photographs, sketches, and early visual records captured these instances, conveying an image of a monarchy that was both authoritative and intimately human. This blending of public spectacle with private sentiment became a defining characteristic of Victoria's reign, reinforcing the notion that personal virtue and family devotion could coexist with the weight of empire and the demands of governance. As the years progressed, the royal family continued to grow in both number and influence. The children's presence in the palace underscored the stability and continuity of the monarchy, while also offering opportunities for subtle cultural leadership. Victoria and Albert encouraged music, literature, and scientific inquiry among their offspring, fostering a cultivated environment that mirrored the intellectual pursuits of the adults. This careful nurturing ensured that the next generation of royals would be prepared for both public duties and private reflection, capable of sustaining the moral and cultural ideals that defined the household. Through these domestic rhythms, Victoria and Albert's palace became more than a seat of power. It became a living emblem of the values they sought to embody: order, devotion, reflection, and attentiveness, qualities cultivated in the quiet repetition of daily life, radiated outward, influencing perceptions of monarchy and providing a framework for societal expectations. Families across Britain, aware of the sovereign's dedication to both duty and personal affection, found in the royal household an aspirational model for the cultivation of virtue and the careful balancing of public and private responsibilities. In this way, the palace itself flourished, blooming not only with the presence of children, but with the deliberate cultivation of intellectual, moral, and cultural life. Every room, corridor, and garden was suffused with purpose, reflecting a vision of monarchy in which family and duty, affection and authority coexist in harmonious balance. The Victorian domestic ideal, as shaped within these walls, gradually extended its influence throughout society, offering a template for personal conduct, family life, and moral attention that would resonate well beyond the 19th century. As the rhythms of palace life settled into their quiet pattern, the steady presence of Victoria and Albert, alongside their growing family, began to form the backdrop for the broader transformations of the era. Industrial progress, social reform, and political evolution continued outside the palace walls, yet within, a deliberate cultivation of order, affection, and moral responsibility unfolded daily. It was within this intertwining of domestic stability and public example that the Victorian ideals of family virtue and disciplined routine were most clearly embodied, creating a legacy that would define not only the reign of Victoria, but the very character of a century. Beyond the carefully ordered corridors of Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and Osborne House, Britain was awakening to a different rhythm, one of movement, invention, and transformation. The calm domestic world of Victoria and Albert, though influential, existed in parallel with a country in the throes of rapid change. Smoke rose from the tall chimneys of factories, the hiss of steam engines punctuated the air, and iron tracks began to stretch across landscapes once defined by fields, forests, and quiet villages. This was the age of industrial transformation, a slow yet inexorable force that reshaped cities, economies, and the daily lives of millions. The Industrial Revolution, though already decades underway by the time Victoria ascended the throne, accelerated in pace during the 1840s and 1850s. Coal-fired engines powered mills and factories, producing textiles, machinery, and tools at a scale previously unimaginable. Towns and cities expanded outward from their historic centers, their streets lined with brick houses and narrow alleys, factories rising like solemn monuments to progress. In London, Manchester, Birmingham, and countless other urban centers, the hum of industry became a constant presence, a subtle rhythm of modernity that contrasted with the ordered stillness of palaces and country estates. Railways, perhaps more than any other invention, symbolized this transformation. Tracks snaked across the countryside, connecting industrial towns with ports, markets, and the heart of the capital. Steam locomotives, dark and powerful, became the lifeblood of commerce, carrying goods, letters, and passengers with a speed that made the old pace of travel seem almost dreamlike by comparison. Stations became hubs of activity, bustling with merchants, laborers, and travelers, all navigating the precise schedules and logistical demands imposed by this new technology. In the early days of rail, the sound of a train's whistle could be startling, cutting through the familiar quiet of town and country alike, a constant reminder that the world was moving faster than it had ever moved before. The factory, too, became an emblem of the Industrial Revolution. Massive structures of brick and iron housed looms, presses, and engines that transformed raw materials into finished goods. Within these spaces, labor was organized with meticulous efficiency, the hours long and the pace unyielding. Men, women, and children toiled under conditions that were often harsh, their lives measured by productivity and survival rather than leisure or education. The smoke and soot that poured from chimneys marked not only technological achievement, but also the social tension inherent in progress. Innovation brought wealth and opportunity for some, while creating struggle and hardship for others. Urban life was thus transformed in its very texture. Streets were crowded with carts, horses, and pedestrians. Marketplaces thrived with the exchange of goods, yet overcrowding, poor sanitation, and limited infrastructure imposed quiet suffering on the working classes. Disease, poverty, and early mortality were persistent companions to the promise of industrial prosperity. The city itself became a complex organism, breathing with the rhythms of labor, commerce, and transportation, simultaneously a site of innovation and a space of profound human struggle. Amid this transformation, the contrast between urban and rural life remained vivid. While industrial cities expanded, the countryside retained its slower, measured rhythms, though even there the influence of mechanization and improved transportation began to penetrate. Agricultural productivity increased through the introduction of machinery and new techniques, yet rural communities felt the pull of migration as young people sought work in factories and towns. The reshaping of population distribution subtly altered social relationships, family structures, and the contours of local economies. The Crown observed these changes with measured attention. Victoria and Albert, through correspondence, visits, and consultations with ministers, were aware of the implications of industrial growth for governance, social stability, and public morality. Public works, education, and charitable efforts emerged as responses to the uneven effects of progress. The monarchy, while distant from the daily toil of factories, held a symbolic position as a stabilizing presence amidst the rapid transformation of society. The Queen's engagement with public welfare, guided in part by Albert's influence, demonstrated a quiet understanding that industrial advancement required both oversight and moral stewardship. The cultural and psychological impact of industrialization was equally profound. Art, literature, and social commentary reflected the tension between progress and poverty, capturing both the marvels of technological achievement and the human cost of mechanized life. Writers, painters, and musicians turned their attention to factories, railways, and urban life, observing the rhythms of labor and the texture of city streets with a meticulous eye. These reflections, often subdued in tone but rich in detail, contributed to a growing awareness of social responsibility and the ethical dimensions of economic change. At the same time, the proliferation of railways and industrial networks fostered connectivity and mobility previously unattainable. People could travel greater distances for work, leisure, or family visits, linking regions of the country in new patterns of interaction. News traveled more quickly, markets were integrated, and the pace of life subtly accelerated, creating both opportunity and tension. The world beyond the palace, once defined by distance and isolation, began to feel smaller, faster, and more interconnected, demanding attention and adaptation from every stratum of society. Industrialization also reshaped leisure and domestic life for those who could access its benefits. Improved production of clothing, furniture, and household goods allowed middle-class families to adopt standards once confined to aristocracy. The spread of gas lighting, the availability of printed materials, and the development of public institutions such as museums and libraries gradually expanded opportunities for education, cultural engagement, and personal enrichment. These changes, while modest at first, subtly influenced expectations of comfort, morality, and civic responsibility, aligning with the values cultivated within the royal household and propagated throughout society. Yet for all the marvels of steam and steel, the human cost remained present, an understated tension threading through the progress of the age. Factories and mines demanded long hours, child labor persisted despite early reforms, and urban living conditions were often cramped and unsanitary. Social reformers, philanthropic organizations, and concerned members of the elite, including Victoria and Albert, sought ways to mitigate these hardships through legislation, charitable work, and advocacy, emphasizing education, health, and moral improvement. The balance between innovation and responsibility, between advancement and humanity, became a defining feature of the period, quietly shaping the ethos of an entire generation. By the late 1840s, Britain had become a landscape of contrasts: the ordered palaces and cultivated estates of the monarchy, the bustling, smoke-filled streets of industrial towns, and the expanding countryside, where new technologies and traditional rhythms coexisted uneasily. The tension between progress and poverty, innovation and human cost, created a landscape both dynamic and fragile, reflecting the complexity of a nation in transition. And as Victoria and Albert oversaw this evolving society, their household continued to serve as both a moral exemplar and a sanctuary of reflection. While the empire expanded, railways stretched across the land, and factories reshaped human labor, the measured rhythms of domestic life within the palace offered a quiet counterpoint, a space where duty, affection, and deliberate cultivation of intellect and character maintained continuity amidst the accelerating pace of change. It was within this interplay of industry, progress, and domestic stability that the character of the Victorian era took shape, a century defined by the tension between movement and stillness, innovation and moral responsibility, public achievement and private cultivation. The whistle of steam engines and the distant clatter of urban life provided a constant reminder that the world was moving forward, while the quiet discipline of family, court, and personal virtue offered a stabilizing presence, ensuring that human values would remain intertwined with the advance of technology and empire. While the steam engines hummed and factories clanged in the industrial centers, a quieter, grittier rhythm persisted in the narrow streets, alleyways, and crowded tenements of Britain's urban working class. In the cities, life unfolded in close quarters, where the demands of labor, the constraints of poverty, and the density of population combined to create an environment simultaneously vibrant and perilous. London, Manchester, Birmingham, and other industrial hubs pulsed with movement and sound, yet beneath the apparent activity, a shadowed reality of struggle and endurance defined the daily existence of those who powered the nation's growing economy. The streets of London, often shrouded in mist and the lingering haze of coal smoke, were a complex tapestry of life. Chimney sweeps, their faces streaked with soot, climbed precariously along brick flues to clean the tall chimneys that puffed black smoke into the overcast sky. Children, some barely older than toddlers, carried bundles of coal, ran errands, or labored in factories and workshops under conditions that demanded long hours and little respite. Market vendors shouted their wares over the roar of carts and the clatter of horse hooves, while the narrow pavements crowded with pedestrians made every step a negotiation of space and survival. In this dense, fog-laden environment, the city seemed alive with both energy and quiet desperation, a living organism moving at the tensioned pace of necessity. Factories were the epicenters of work and exhaustion. Inside, rows of machines, looms, and presses moved relentlessly, powered by the rhythm of steam engines and the ceaseless labor of hands and feet. Women worked alongside men, often performing repetitive, physically demanding tasks, while children's small bodies were employed in tasks that required nimbleness or access to spaces adults could not reach. The hours were long, stretching from dawn to dusk, and the conditions were harsh, the air thick with lint, dust, and smoke, the clamor of machinery deafening, the floor slick with water, oil, or spilled substances. Injury and illness were constant companions, and rest was often brief and confined to poorly furnished rooms in overcrowded tenements. Life in the tenements amplified these hardships. Families crowded into small, poorly ventilated apartments, often sharing single rooms or floors with multiple households. Sanitation was minimal, water supplies limited, and disease spread swiftly. Cholera, typhus, and smallpox were frequent threats, and the mortality rates for children and adults alike reflected the precariousness of everyday existence. Yet within these spaces, human resilience persisted. Neighbors offered support, children played in alleys when possible, and communities maintained traditions, stories, and networks of care that mitigated some of the stark realities of urban life. The contrast between the working class and the relative comfort of the royal household could scarcely have been greater. While Victoria and Albert nurtured their children in carefully ordered gardens, libraries, and drawing rooms, millions of families in industrial cities contended with environments that demanded both endurance and ingenuity. The disparities were stark, and yet they were quietly observed by reformers, philanthropists, and eventually the monarchy itself. Victoria, increasingly aware of her role as a moral exemplar and custodian of national well-being, engaged with initiatives aimed at alleviating suffering, promoting education, and improving public health, often guided by the detailed reports and advice of her ministers and social observers. One of the responses to these conditions was the emergence of a social conscience among policymakers, reformers, and moral leaders. Reports on factory conditions, child labor, and urban squalor prompted gradual legislative reforms, from limitations on working hours to regulations for sanitation and housing. Philanthropic societies, charitable schools, and religious organizations sought to educate and care for those affected by industrialization, striving to create pockets of stability and opportunity within a larger, often chaotic urban landscape. These measures, though incremental, reflected a growing recognition that progress carried responsibilities, and that the prosperity created by industrial growth must be tempered with attention to human welfare. The streets themselves were not only sites of labor, but also of observation and adaptation. Children learned trades from an early age, acquiring skills that might secure future employment or supplement household income. Families navigated the intricate economy of markets, wages, and rent with ingenuity, forming networks of mutual assistance and social cohesion that provided both material and emotional support. Public spaces, however limited, became arenas of informal gathering, recreation, and cultural exchange, offering relief from the intensity of work and the confinement of domestic spaces. Fog and smoke created a muted, almost spectral quality to urban life. The Thames, winding through London, was often obscured by haze, its surface reflecting the dim glow of gas lamps and the movement of barges carrying goods to markets. The city's soundscape, whistles, bells, the creak of carts, and the murmur of voices formed a constant backdrop, a steady rhythm against which human endeavor unfolded. This environment, simultaneously oppressive and dynamic, shaped the character of those who inhabited it, fostering resilience, adaptability, and a deep awareness of community reliance. Within this context, the monarchy's awareness of urban hardship influenced public perception and policy. Victoria and Albert, while removed from the immediate pressures of industrial life, engaged with reports, commissions, and visits that illuminated the conditions of ordinary citizens. Their concern, though expressed with the subtlety expected of a constitutional monarchy, reflected a growing sense that national progress must align with ethical responsibility. The moral weight of witnessing suffering, combined with a desire to foster stability, underpinned a range of initiatives aimed at education, health, and welfare, quietly reinforcing the social contract between crown and citizen. The gradual reforms that emerged from this awareness were neither immediate nor comprehensive, yet they represented a shift in societal consciousness. Factory acts limited child labor, laws improved sanitation, and philanthropic ventures expanded educational access. These developments, though often incremental, offered a measure of relief and hope, signaling that the nation's industrial and urban transformation could be guided by principles of care and justice, even amid the relentless pace of technological and economic change. The lived reality of the urban working class, therefore, was both a testament to human endurance and a mirror reflecting the challenges of a rapidly modernizing society. From soot-streaked children to women and men navigating factories, workshops, and crowded tenements, life in the city demanded constant adaptation. Yet within this hardship, communities preserved networks of support, shared knowledge, and cultural continuity that mitigated the harsher aspects of industrial progress. The tension between suffering and progress, between poverty and opportunity, became a defining feature of the Victorian era, a shadowed backdrop to the prosperity celebrated in palaces and exhibitions. In this way, the streets and alleys of Britain formed a counterpoint to the ordered life of the royal household. Where palaces exemplified measured virtue, domestic harmony, and intellectual cultivation, the urban landscape revealed the consequences of industrial expansion and the pressing need for social conscience. The interplay between these spheres, the private cultivation of character and the public manifestation of reform, shaped the ethos of the period, quietly embedding principles of moral responsibility, civic engagement, and social awareness into the broader fabric of society. Amid the dense fog and coal smoke, the lives of ordinary workers persisted with remarkable resilience, their daily toil forming the hidden foundation upon which the grandeur of the empire rested. The monarchy, aware of both the promise and peril of industrial transformation, increasingly embraced its symbolic role as a stabilizing force, reinforcing the moral and cultural values that sustained continuity in an era of rapid and often disorienting change. While the smoke of factories mingled with the fog in Britain's cities, and the ceaseless hum of industry reshaped lives in streets and alleys, a quieter yet equally pervasive force was weaving itself into the fabric of society. Beyond labor and commerce, a moral and spiritual framework began to take shape, quietly informing the conduct of individuals, families, and communities across the nation. This framework, emerging in the mid-19th century, became the defining ethos of the Victorian age, a complex interplay of faith, propriety, and moral expectation that permeated daily life, social structures, and even the arts. At the heart of this ethos was religion, particularly the evangelical influence that gained prominence during Victoria's early reign. Churches, chapels, and mission halls served not only as sites of worship, but as centers of education, charitable outreach, and moral instruction. Sermons emphasized personal responsibility, ethical behavior, and devotion to family and community, fostering a sense of moral order that extended from domestic life to public engagement. Ministers and moral reformers sought to instill discipline, temperance, and integrity, encouraging citizens to balance ambition with ethical restraint and work with devotion to both family and nation. This moral sensibility was closely intertwined with the monarchy itself. Victoria and Albert, devout and deeply attentive to the responsibilities of personal conduct, exemplified the virtues increasingly valorized by society. Their household, with its emphasis on family, education, and domestic harmony, served as a model for citizens seeking to navigate the complexities of industrial, social, and political life. The Queen's private devotion and the couple's commitment to ethical stewardship of power became symbolic touchstones, reinforcing the importance of faith, duty, and propriety in public and private life alike. Propriety, in particular, became a codified element of Victorian culture. Behavior was carefully structured according to social norms, etiquette, and expectations of decorum. These standards guided interactions in court, among the middle classes, and within families, shaping how people spoke, dressed, and conducted themselves in both public and private spheres. Children were educated not only in literacy and numeracy, but in manners, moral reasoning, and social responsibility, reflecting a belief that character, as much as achievement, defined social worth. Within this moral universe, virtue was often synonymous with restraint, modesty, and diligence, qualities that both reflected and reinforced the broader social order. The emphasis on family life and domestic morality was inseparable from these values. Households were conceived as microcosms of the moral and social order, where parents modeled virtue, children learned responsibility, and daily routines cultivated discipline. The careful orchestration of mealtimes, study hours, and household chores reflected broader societal expectations, emphasizing the interdependence of personal conduct and collective well-being. In both aristocratic and middle-class homes, these patterns of domestic virtue became aspirational ideals, communicated through literature, periodicals, and etiquette manuals that proliferated during the Victorian era. Art and culture were similarly shaped by this moral sensibility. Literature, painting, and theatre often reflected the prevailing ethical framework, portraying characters whose success or failure was measured by adherence to moral principles. Moral narratives emphasized virtue, humility, and diligence, contrasting the consequences of vice or irresponsibility. Architecture and interior design also echoed these values. The symmetry of rooms, the careful arrangement of furniture, and the emphasis on cleanliness and order conveyed both aesthetic beauty and ethical intentionality. In these ways, moral principles were embedded not only in conduct but in the very spaces and objects that defined daily life. Education was another vital channel for the transmission of moral values. Schools, Sunday schools, and charitable institutions emphasized both literacy and ethical instruction, reinforcing the interconnection of knowledge, character, and civic duty. Girls and boys were taught not only reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also virtues such as diligence, temperance, and obedience to both familial and social hierarchies. This emphasis on moral education cultivated a sense of responsibility that extended beyond the household into public life, contributing to a national culture in which personal conduct and social harmony were deeply intertwined. The Victorian ethos was also marked by the intertwining of religious devotion with civic duty. Charity, philanthropy, and public service were seen as extensions of moral obligation rather than optional acts of generosity. Wealth and privilege were to be tempered with responsibility, and the moral imperative to aid the less fortunate became central to public discourse. Missionary work, both domestic and overseas, exemplified this principle, linking the expansion of the British Empire with a perceived duty to spread not only governance, but moral guidance and spiritual instruction. Within the monarchy itself, the integration of faith and morality became a defining feature of Victoria's personal and public identity. The Queen's diaries reveal an acute awareness of her role as a moral exemplar, her daily actions guided by a sense of divine responsibility and ethical obligation. Albert's influence, with his methodical intellect and deep engagement with educational, artistic, and scientific pursuits, reinforced this moral framework, demonstrating how personal devotion could complement public stewardship. Together, their household embodied the ideals of restraint, diligence, and cultivated virtue, offering both a model and a benchmark for the nation. Social reform movements, emerging in response to the hardships revealed by industrialization, were infused with this moral sensibility. Advocates for labor reform, public health initiatives, and educational expansion often invoked ethical imperatives, framing their campaigns in terms of duty, morality, and the cultivation of character. These efforts reflected a broader conviction that progress, whether industrial, scientific, or social, must be guided by ethical responsibility, lest human suffering outweigh material advancement. The result was a distinctive Victorian synthesis of moral vigilance and practical reform, in which virtue and public service were inseparable. The pervasiveness of these values also shaped patterns of personal conduct and aspiration. Social mobility, though constrained by class structures, was increasingly accompanied by an expectation of moral cultivation, diligence, and propriety. Literature and periodicals encouraged citizens to emulate virtues exemplified by the monarchy and moral leaders, creating a feedback loop in which personal development, social perception, and national identity were mutually reinforcing. Even leisure, travel, and recreation were imbued with expectations of moderation, refinement, and ethical awareness. By the mid-19th century, the moral fabric of Britain had been subtly but profoundly transformed. Faith, duty, decorum, and propriety had become guiding principles, infusing family life, public behavior, education, and culture. The Victorian ethos, far from being merely a set of prescriptions, shaped the sensibilities, aspirations, and rhythms of daily existence, providing a moral compass in an era defined by rapid industrial, social, and imperial change. It was within this framework that the monarchy continued to play its symbolic and stabilizing role. Victoria and Albert's household, with its blend of domestic harmony, intellectual engagement, and moral reflection, served as a touchstone for citizens navigating the shifting landscapes of cities, factories, and empires. Their example reinforced the importance of measured behavior, ethical responsibility, and cultivated virtue, anchoring public consciousness in a moral order that extended beyond the walls of palaces and permeated the culture at large. Through the quiet integration of faith, duty, and decorum into daily life, the Victorian ethos shaped not only individual conduct but also the collective character of the nation. It provided a lens through which the challenges of industrialization, urbanization, and empire could be interpreted, guiding behavior, inspiring reform, and embedding a sense of moral purpose into the consciousness of a rapidly changing society. While the moral compass of Victorian society quietly guided conduct, and the rhythms of industry and domestic life shaped daily existence, another current of curiosity and contemplation swept across the nation, broadening the collective imagination and expanding the horizons of thought. The 19th century was in many ways an era of measured wonder, in which science, exploration, and discovery reshaped the understanding of both the natural world and humanity's place within it. Amid the gentle routines of domestic life and the ceaseless pulse of industrial cities, the Victorian mind was captivated by questions of life, landscape, and the unknown, each new discovery quietly altering perspectives and inspiring contemplation. At the forefront of this intellectual transformation was Charles Darwin, whose observations and reflections on the natural world culminated in the theory of evolution by natural selection. His seminal work On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, presented a framework for understanding life as dynamic, adaptive, and interconnected, challenging long-held assumptions while evoking a measured fascination rather than immediate upheaval. Victorian society approached Darwin's ideas with a mixture of awe, cautious consideration, and intellectual debate. Scientific societies, learned clubs, and salons provided spaces where ideas could be discussed, questioned, and refined, fostering a culture of inquiry that extended from universities to drawing rooms, subtly influencing both professional scholars and interested citizens. Exploration, both geographic and cultural, captured the imagination with equal intensity. The Arctic regions, with their stark expanses of ice, snow, and ocean, drew adventurers who measured distances, recorded temperatures, and mapped previously unknown coastlines. Expeditions into Africa uncovered landscapes, peoples, and ecosystems previously unfamiliar to European audiences, generating accounts of careful observation that blended scientific rigor with narrative description. Each journey, whether by ship, overland caravan, or riverboat, contributed to a growing accumulation of knowledge, quietly expanding the boundaries of what was considered knowable and attainable. Scientific societies, flourishing throughout Britain, served as hubs for the exchange of knowledge, bringing together naturalists, chemists, astronomers, and engineers. Meetings, journals, and correspondence facilitated the slow, deliberate dissemination of discovery, emphasizing careful observation, experimentation, and documentation. Within these institutions, ideas were evaluated on the basis of evidence, method, and reproducibility, reflecting a commitment to precision, patience, and intellectual integrity that characterized the era. The discoveries shared and debated in these spaces gradually informed broader societal understanding, influencing education, policy, and public perception. Even within domestic spaces, the spirit of discovery found expression. Victoria and Albert themselves were keen observers and patrons of science, supporting the collection of specimens, the development of museums, and the patronage of scholars and explorers. Within palace libraries and drawing rooms, discussions of geology, astronomy, and biology unfolded alongside more conventional cultural pursuits, offering a measured engagement with the questions and methods of scientific inquiry. Children were exposed to these ideas with care and attention, learning to approach observation with both curiosity and discipline, internalizing the ethos that knowledge required patience, reflection, and meticulous study. The publication of discoveries often carried a gentle excitement, measured rather than frantic, as the broader public assimilated knowledge about distant lands, strange creatures, and the processes shaping life itself. Illustrated journals, scientific treatises, and lecture series provided windows into worlds beyond ordinary experience, inviting contemplation of patterns, order, and adaptation. Explorers' journals, often richly detailed and meticulously recorded, conveyed both the challenges of travel and the awe of encountering unfamiliar environments, fostering a sense of calm wonder rather than sensationalism. Darwin's theory, in particular, invited reflection on the interconnections between species, the role of environment in shaping life, and the slow unfolding of natural processes. The idea that species evolved through gradual adaptation resonated with a society already attuned to incremental progress in industry, social reform, and moral cultivation. The Victorian worldview, which emphasized observation, rationality, and measured improvement, found a subtle resonance with evolutionary theory. The natural world itself was a testament to the quiet but inexorable power of change, guided by circumstance and adaptation. Exploration extended into the practical and technological realms as well. Engineers and inventors undertook journeys to observe new machinery, mining techniques, and transportation methods, applying insights from abroad to domestic projects. Railways, canals, and port infrastructure were refined through careful study of global practices, blending curiosity with pragmatism. Scientific instrumentation, from telescopes to barometers, facilitated precise measurement, reinforcing a culture in which careful observation underpinned both understanding and action. Knowledge, slowly accumulated and meticulously recorded, became a shared resource, informing decisions in governance, commerce, and education. In the arts and literature, this expanding horizon of knowledge influenced both theme and technique. Writers depicted distant lands, natural phenomena, and scientific observation with a precision that reflected careful study, while painters rendered landscapes, flora, and fauna with detailed fidelity, reflecting the era's fascination with empirical understanding. Music, architecture, and design also absorbed influences from exploration, creating subtle patterns of innovation that merged aesthetic sensibility with curiosity about the wider world. In all these spheres, the calm engagement with discovery complemented the moral and domestic frameworks cultivated within households like that of Victoria and Albert. The slow march of discovery and exploration was not without its challenges. Misinterpretations, debates, and the limits of contemporary technology occasionally created uncertainty, yet the Victorian approach emphasized careful deliberation, verification, and respect for evidence. The ethos of patience, observation, and measured reflection shaped responses to both intellectual and practical questions, ensuring that the excitement of discovery was tempered with rational engagement and contemplative assessment. This balance mirrored broader societal patterns. The rush of industrial change was moderated by ethical considerations, domestic order, and moral expectation, creating a culture in which curiosity and responsibility were intertwined. By the late 1850s, the Victorian worldview had expanded to incorporate a sense of both local and global awareness. Knowledge of distant continents, unfamiliar species, and scientific principles reshaped education, conversation, and governance. Citizens and leaders alike were encouraged to cultivate understanding, reflection, and ethical engagement with new realities. This deliberate expansion of intellectual horizons complemented the moral and domestic structures already established, creating a coherent cultural vision in which progress, curiosity, and responsibility were interdependent. It was in this climate that the monarchy continued to symbolize stability, reflection, and moral authority. Victoria and Albert's patronage of exploration, scientific study, and cultural documentation reinforced the notion that the pursuit of knowledge was a noble endeavor, to be pursued with care, attention, and respect for both evidence and ethical consequence. Within the calm, measured framework of the royal household, these values were nurtured, exemplifying a manner of engagement that combined curiosity with prudence, intellect with morality. Through the steady accumulation of observation, the careful documentation of discoveries, and the thoughtful interpretation of new knowledge, the Victorian century cultivated a sense of wonder grounded in discipline. Science, exploration, and discovery were not spectacles for immediate sensation. They were measured processes that reshaped understanding over time, extending the horizons of human perception while maintaining a contemplative, deliberate approach to the mysteries of life and the natural world. As the Victorian imagination expanded through science, exploration, and the meticulous pursuit of knowledge, a physical embodiment of that vision emerged in the heart of London. In 1851, Hyde Park, a familiar expanse of greenery and quiet paths, became the stage for an event that would crystallize the ideals, ambitions, and confidence of an era, the Great Exhibition. Conceived by Prince Albert, and shaped by his meticulous intellect and aesthetic sensibility, the exhibition was more than a display of objects. It was a deliberate orchestration of culture, industry, and moral purpose, a reflection of Britain's self-assured position within a world increasingly defined by innovation, commerce, and empire. The building itself, the Crystal Palace, was a marvel of engineering and design, constructed almost entirely of glass and iron. Rising from the gentle contours of Hyde Park, it glimmered in the sunlight, a geometric lattice of transparency and structure that seemed almost ethereal. Within its vast interior, the space was carefully partitioned into galleries, corridors, and halls, each intended to present objects with clarity, elegance, and pedagogical purpose. Light filtered through the glass roof in shifting patterns, illuminating displays of machinery, textiles, and art, while the very architecture communicated a message of progress, rationality, and human ingenuity. Inside the Crystal Palace, the meticulous arrangement of exhibits reflected both aesthetic sensibility and a commitment to intellectual order. Industrial machinery, demonstrating the latest advancements in textiles, metallurgy, and manufacturing, was juxtaposed with artistic works, fine craftsmanship, and decorative objects. The exhibition of objects from across the globe, from the colonies and foreign nations, reinforced Britain's imperial reach, offering visitors a measured encounter with the wealth of human achievement, both domestic and international. Each display was curated to educate, inspire, and demonstrate the possibilities inherent in diligence, ingenuity, and moral purpose. Prince Albert's vision extended beyond mere display. He imagined the exhibition as a space in which the accomplishments of human labor, guided by intellect and ethical cultivation, could be appreciated and reflected upon. Science and art were presented not in opposition, but in harmonious relationship. The practical and the aesthetic integrated to convey a holistic understanding of progress. Machines demonstrated the power of industry, while paintings, ceramics, and decorative arts illustrated the refinement of culture, creating a sense of continuity between technical innovation and moral and artistic cultivation. The atmosphere within the Crystal Palace was one of subdued excitement. Visitors moved along wide, well-lit aisles, observing, comparing, and reflecting. Scholars and mechanics, aristocrats and tradespeople, young students and seasoned professionals all participated in a quiet, contemplative exchange of knowledge. The hum of conversation, punctuated by the measured clatter of machinery in demonstration, created a rhythm that was neither chaotic nor hurried. Instead, it reflected the Victorian ideal of deliberate, informed engagement with the world. Every detail, from signage to display arrangement, was designed to facilitate understanding and reflection, emphasizing order, comprehension, and the subtle beauty of human achievement. The exhibition also reflected the confidence of Britain at the height of its industrial and imperial influence. Displays of textile looms, steam engines, and intricate machinery underscored the nation's technological dominance, while the inclusion of fine arts, decorative crafts, and scientific instruments demonstrated cultural refinement alongside industrial capability. The careful juxtaposition of these domains reinforced the notion that moral, intellectual, and technical cultivation were mutually reinforcing, forming the foundation for both national prosperity and international prestige. Beyond the immediate spectacle, the Great Exhibition carried profound social and cultural implications. It was intended not merely to impress, but to educate. Schools sent groups of students to observe machinery and art. Artisans and tradespeople could study techniques and materials. Visitors of all classes encountered a world of disciplined innovation and achievement. The underlying message, implicit yet pervasive, was that progress was attainable through careful observation, moral diligence, and sustained labor. Knowledge, skill, and virtue were intertwined, and the exhibition provided a tangible representation of these principles in action. Preparations for the exhibition had been meticulous. Albert oversaw the planning with characteristic attention to detail, ensuring that each element, from construction to cataloguing of exhibits, aligned with both aesthetic and educational objectives. Logistics, lighting, and accessibility were carefully considered, reflecting a commitment to inclusivity, clarity, and moral purpose. The success of the event depended not only on the grandeur of its objects, but on the measured presentation and the quiet, contemplative engagement it invited. The impact of the exhibition extended far beyond Hyde Park. Newspapers, periodicals, and illustrations disseminated images of the Crystal Palace, its exhibits, and the visitors navigating its vast halls. These representations reinforced the cultural ideals of the era, projecting an image of Britain as a nation of moral diligence, intellectual curiosity, and technical mastery. International delegations and contributions further enhanced the exhibition's symbolic significance, framing Britain as a centre of commerce, culture, and ethical leadership within a global context. Yet amid this celebration of achievement, the Great Exhibition also reflected Victorian restraint. There was no ostentation for its own sake, no chaotic spectacle, rather every element conveyed purpose, balance, and decorum. The visitor's engagement was intended to be reflective, encouraging contemplation and appreciation rather than impulsive admiration. This careful orchestration mirrored broader societal patterns, the balance of moral discipline with intellectual curiosity, domestic order with public responsibility, and technological advancement with ethical consideration. The success of the Great Exhibition, both in immediate terms and in its enduring cultural influence, illustrated the harmonization of multiple dimensions of Victorian life. Industry, science, art, and moral purpose converged within the Crystal Palace, demonstrating that human progress could be represented, celebrated, and understood in a structured, reflective environment. The quiet dignity of the exhibition reflected the measured confidence of a nation confident in its achievements yet committed to ongoing cultivation of knowledge, virtue, and skill. As visitors left the halls, crossing the gardens of Hyde Park into the quieter streets beyond, the impact of the experience lingered subtly in thought and conversation. The exhibition had demonstrated that progress was not merely mechanical or aesthetic, it was also moral, intellectual, and social. It had embodied the Victorian ideals of careful cultivation, ethical engagement, and reflective appreciation, offering a vision of what human effort guided by discipline and virtue could accomplish. The Crystal Palace itself, though eventually relocated and transformed, remained an enduring symbol of these principles. Its glass walls and iron framework, gleaming with transparency and order, captured the essence of an era that sought to harmonize industrial prowess, artistic achievement, and moral purpose. In doing so, it became a lens through which the broader currents of Victorian society could be appreciated, measured, disciplined, and quietly confident, yet suffused with wonder and possibility. While the Crystal Palace glittered with the quiet brilliance of human ingenuity, and the streets of Britain hummed with the rhythms of industry and domestic order, distant lands carried the muffled thunder of conflict. The Victorian era, though defined by domestic propriety, moral vigilance, and intellectual exploration, was also a period in which the empire and its far-flung territories faced trials that reverberated back to the corridors of power in London. The Crimean War, the Indian Uprising of 1857, and other colonial engagements challenged the balance between national ambition, moral responsibility, and the careful cultivation of governance that defined Victoria's reign. These events, unfolding far from the orderly streets and palace gardens, left subtle yet profound imprints on policy, conscience and the perception of empire. The Crimean War, which began in 1853, emerged from complex geopolitical tensions between Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Russia. Though the battles themselves occurred across the Black Sea, Crimea, and the surrounding territories, their effects were felt deeply within Britain. News arrived slowly yet consistently, carried by newspapers, letters, and official dispatches. The press conveyed detailed accounts of battles, sieges, and the experiences of soldiers, often blending observation with reflection. The narrative of suffering, endurance, and logistical struggle reached the public with a quiet intensity, emphasizing both the bravery of participants and the challenges of modern warfare. Victoria, though constitutionally removed from direct military command, experienced the war with a measured awareness of her symbolic role as sovereign. Her concern extended not only to the political and military outcomes, but to the moral and human dimensions of conflict. Correspondence with military leaders, accounts of hospital conditions, and reports from observers allowed her to understand the scope of the struggle, and her personal attention to the welfare of soldiers reflected a sense of ethical stewardship that complemented the broader responsibilities of governance. The Queen's private reflection and her engagement with the experiences of ordinary participants mirrored the era's broader moral consciousness, in which duty and compassion were inseparable from national ambition. The logistical and medical aspects of the Crimean War revealed both the challenges of modern conflict and the potential for reform. Conditions in the camps and hospitals were often harsh, exposing deficiencies in planning, sanitation, and provision. The reports of Florence Nightingale, herself quietly meticulous and attentive, highlighted the need for reform in nursing and medical care, emphasizing hygiene, organization, and patient well-being. These developments, though arising from tragedy, contributed to the evolution of public health and military administration, reflecting the Victorian ideal that even adversity could yield progress when met with careful observation and ethical action. Across continents, India faced its own profound upheaval in the uprising of 1857, often referred to as the Sepoy Mutiny. The rebellion arose from long-standing grievances within the colonial administration, combined with immediate triggers that inflamed tensions among soldiers and civilians alike. While geographically distant, the events resonated within Britain, drawing attention to the complexities and responsibilities of imperial rule. Reports of sieges, battles, and civilian suffering circulated slowly but persistently, shaping public perception and prompting reflection on the moral and administrative obligations inherent in maintaining an empire. The Indian uprising forced both the monarchy and government to confront questions of governance, justice, and accountability. Decisions made in the councils of London had consequences thousands of miles away, highlighting the interconnection of empire and domestic responsibility. Victoria's role, while symbolic, carried moral weight. Her reflections, counsel, and approval of policies underscored the necessity of balancing imperial authority with humane consideration, a delicate tension that defined much of her reign. The rebellion also prompted reforms in administration, military organization, and education, gradually reshaping the mechanisms through which the empire functioned and responded to crises. Colonial conflicts elsewhere, though less prominent, shared similar patterns. Engagements in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific reflected both the expansionist ambitions of Britain and the challenges of governing diverse populations across vast distances. Each conflict, though remote, carried echoes of moral responsibility, logistical complexity, and the delicate management of public opinion. Newspapers, journals, and letters conveyed the experiences of soldiers, administrators, and civilians alike, creating a network of observation through which the domestic public remained aware, if distantly, of the empire's trials and triumphs. These distant conflicts, while often perceived as abstract or removed from daily life in London, nonetheless shaped the consciousness of Victorian society. They prompted reflection on the responsibilities of power, the human costs of governance, and the ethical dimensions of progress and empire. Soldiers' experiences, civilian suffering, and administrative challenges became subjects of discussion in homes, schools, and clubs, reinforcing the Victorian inclination to integrate moral consideration with practical action. The interplay between observation, reflection, and decision-making reflected the broader cultural patterns of the era, emphasizing measured judgment, ethical stewardship, and the cultivation of virtue even amid adversity. The quiet influence of these events extended into cultural production as well. Literature, art, and journalism depicted the distant wars with careful attention to detail, portraying both the heroism and the suffering involved. Painters rendered scenes of battle and aftermath with meticulous composition, while writers and journalists balanced narrative with observation, emphasizing the moral and practical lessons embedded in conflict. These portrayals reinforced the Victorian emphasis on reflection, empathy, and ethical engagement, reminding citizens that the consequences of empire were not confined to abstract policy, but were lived experiences with tangible human impact. The convergence of domestic stability and distant conflict highlighted the dual responsibilities of the monarchy. Within the palace, the rhythms of family life, moral cultivation, and intellectual engagement persisted, providing a stabilizing counterpoint to the uncertainties of the wider world. Beyond the palace walls, the ethical implications of empire, the management of war, and the cultivation of public confidence demanded attention to detail, careful judgment, and a steadfast sense of duty. In this way, the monarchy acted as both observer and moral anchor, linking the immediate domestic sphere with the broader complexities of governance, diplomacy, and imperial responsibility. Ultimately, the Crimean War, the Indian Uprising, and other colonial conflicts left subtle yet lasting effects on Victorian society. Reforms in military administration, public health, and colonial governance emerged from these crises, reflecting the principle that careful observation, ethical consideration, and deliberate action could transform adversity into progress. Public awareness of distant suffering fostered a sense of moral responsibility and civic engagement, embedding ethical reflection into the consciousness of citizens and leaders alike. In this interplay between conflict and contemplation, the Victorian era revealed its capacity to balance the demands of empire with the cultivation of virtue, the management of distant crises with the quiet rhythms of domestic and public life. The muffled thunder of war, though distant, shaped policy, conscience, and perception, reminding the nation that progress, expansion, and prosperity were inseparable from reflection, responsibility, and moral vigilance. In the midst of industrial triumph, expanding empire, and the steady progress of domestic and cultural life, the royal household experienced a profound, intimate shadow that would quietly define the remainder of Queen Victoria's reign. The death of Prince Albert in December 1861 marked the end of an era of shared governance, intellectual partnership, and domestic harmony within the palace. His passing was not accompanied by fanfare or spectacle, but by a quiet, lingering grief, a deep and enduring absence that reshaped the rhythms of palace life, the texture of domestic space, and the public perception of the monarchy itself. Victoria's grief was both personal and public, though expressed with a measured restraint that became characteristic of her later years. Her diaries, filled with careful observation of daily routines and reflections on memory, reveal a mind attuned to the subtle interplay between mourning, duty, and the ongoing management of the nation. For the Queen, Albert's death was not only the loss of a husband, but the disruption of a carefully ordered household in which moral guidance, intellectual engagement, and affection had been intertwined. The quiet companionship that had structured her days, from early morning consultations to shared evenings of study and reflection, was replaced by the echo of absence, a stillness that permeated rooms once vibrant with conversation and planning. In response to this personal loss, Victoria withdrew from much of public life. The black attire she adopted became both a symbol and a practice of mourning, a deliberate and constant reminder of the presence she had lost. Her public appearances became rare, measured and subdued, conducted with an understated dignity that communicated both sorrow and continuity of duty. Courtiers, ministers, and citizens alike perceived the weight of this mourning, noting the solemnity of palace rituals and the quiet precision with which the queen carried out her obligations. Even in seclusion, her engagement with governance continued, though it was expressed through correspondence, careful counsel, and measured oversight rather than the public visibility that had characterized her earlier reign. The household itself adapted to this new rhythm. Spaces that had once been shared with Albert, from study rooms to private gardens, were imbued with memory and absence, each detail recalling the presence that once harmonized the routines of domestic life. The Queen's children, many of whom had grown under Albert's attentive guidance, navigated their own grief, while the palace staff adjusted to the altered dynamics of authority and intimacy. Within this quiet domestic sphere, the monarchy's personal dimension became intertwined with national perception. The Queen's mourning was understood not merely as private sorrow but as a reflection of the moral seriousness, emotional depth, and endurance expected of the crown. The effect of Albert's death extended beyond the palace walls, influencing public sentiment and the tone of national life. Victoria's prolonged mourning, though occasionally criticized for its austerity, established a model of restraint and dignity, emphasizing the interconnection of personal loss and public responsibility. Her silence and seclusion encouraged reflection among citizens, reinforcing Victorian ideals of measured emotion, moral cultivation, and the careful management of grief. In the streets, workshops, and drawing rooms of Britain, discussions of the Queen's mourning subtly reinforced cultural norms. Sorrow could be expressed with dignity, emotion tempered by duty, and personal loss integrated into the ongoing responsibilities of life. Victoria's intellectual and moral engagement, while private, continued during this period. She read extensively, corresponded with ministers, and guided decisions regarding social reform, international relations, and education, demonstrating that grief need not diminish responsibility. Her diaries reveal a mind engaged with reflection, planning, and ethical deliberation, balancing the intensity of private sorrow with the demands of sovereign authority. The combination of introspection and action, of mourning and governance, created a distinctive tone that came to define the latter decades of her reign, emphasizing patience, reflection, and the integration of emotion with duty. This period also highlighted the intimate partnership Victoria had shared with Albert. Their collaboration had encompassed domestic management, political counsel, patronage of the arts, and the promotion of scientific and cultural initiatives. The absence of his guiding presence was therefore felt across multiple dimensions of life, from the orchestration of family routines to the subtleties of statecraft. Yet even in loss, Victoria's commitment to these shared ideals endured, as she maintained the structures, patronages, and intellectual pursuits that had defined their union, preserving the continuity of domestic and moral order amidst personal sorrow. Public commemorations and memorials reinforced the significance of Albert's contributions while subtly acknowledging the Queen's mourning. Monuments, dedications, and exhibitions celebrated both the prince's influence and the values he had helped to cultivate: diligence, intellectual curiosity, and moral responsibility. These gestures allowed citizens to participate in a shared acknowledgement of loss and achievement, bridging private grief and national memory. The monarchy's personal sorrow thus became intertwined with collective identity, reinforcing the symbolic and ethical dimensions of the crown, even as it marked a period of profound emotional absence. The quiet endurance of grief also influenced Victoria's approach to diplomacy, politics, and international relations. While she remained attentive to state matters, her engagement was characterized by reflection, correspondence, and selective public appearances. Decisions were considered carefully, with a weight of deliberation that reflected both her personal temperament and the seriousness of her responsibilities. In this way, mourning shaped not only domestic life, but also the conduct of the monarchy in its broader national and imperial role, reinforcing the association between ethical consideration, emotional depth, and governance. The rhythm of the palace, once shared with Albert, now became a private meditation on memory, duty, and continuity. Gardens, libraries, and private chambers were infused with recollections of conversations, decisions, and moments of quiet companionship. The Queen's children and household staff adapted to routines structured by reflection rather than partnership, preserving both functionality and the emotional tone of absence. Even within public ceremonial life, the subtle cues of attire, demeanor, and ritual conveyed the weight of mourning and the ongoing significance of personal integrity in the exercise of sovereign duty. In broader cultural terms, Victoria's mourning exemplified the integration of personal experience with societal expectation. The subdued tone of the monarchy reinforced national ideals of restraint, dignity, and moral reflection. Literature, periodicals, and social discourse echoed these themes, portraying grief as a serious, contemplative, and morally coherent aspect of life, rather than a display of impulsive emotion. The Queen's private sorrow thus became a lens through which citizens could interpret the proper balance of emotion, reflection, and duty, further embedding moral and emotional cultivation into the consciousness of Victorian society. Ultimately, the death of Prince Albert marked a turning point in the reign of Queen Victoria, not only for its intimate impact on her personal life, but for the subtle reshaping of the monarchy's public persona. The period of mourning, characterized by black attire, measured withdrawal, and reflective engagement with duty, established a tone that would define decades of her reign: solemn yet disciplined, introspective yet responsible, private in grief, yet conscious of public symbolism. Within this quiet continuity, the monarchy continued to exercise influence, model virtue, and maintain stability, demonstrating the interplay of personal loss, moral reflection, and sustained responsibility that was central to Victorian identity. As the quiet mourning of the palace slowly gave way to measured engagement with public and state affairs, the horizon of Britain's influence stretched ever wider, encompassing territories, peoples, and trade networks across continents. The Victorian era was a time in which the reach of empire, though often discussed in terms of politics, commerce, and conquest, unfolded with a tranquil yet pervasive presence, extending from the teeming cities of India to the sun-scorched plains of Africa, and further still to the distant islands of the Pacific. The vastness of Britain's dominion, sometimes described with the poetic phrase of a sun never setting, reflected a complex interweaving of economic ambition, moral philosophy, and the deliberate cultivation of governance that, while imposing, was often conducted with meticulous attention to order, propriety, and measured administration. India, the jewel of the empire, exemplified the scale and intricacy of imperial management. The British Raj, administered by civil servants, military officers, and local intermediaries, sought to balance authority with careful oversight. From the bustling streets of Calcutta and Bombay to the rural villages and agricultural heartlands, the empire's influence was exercised through legal frameworks, taxation, infrastructure projects, and educational initiatives. Railways, telegraph lines, and ports connected regions separated by vast distances, facilitating both commerce and governance, while simultaneously introducing new patterns of cultural exchange, social influence, and technological transformation. Africa, though geographically varied and culturally diverse, became another arena of careful expansion. British settlements, trade outposts, and protectorates extended along coastal regions and inland territories, often negotiated through treaties, exploration, and the presence of local intermediaries. Missionary work and educational programs accompanied commercial and strategic interests, reinforcing the notion, prevalent among Victorian administrators, that moral and ethical guidance could accompany political authority. In practice, this careful orchestration sought to project stability, civilization, and ethical stewardship, even amid the inevitable tensions and complexities of colonial administration. Trade routes extending across oceans and rivers were arteries of both material and symbolic significance. Merchant fleets transported textiles, spices, tea, coal, and manufactured goods, linking metropolitan centers with ports, towns, and harbors across the globe. The movement of goods, while inherently commercial, also reflected broader cultural and ethical assumptions. The projection of British order, standards of conduct, and technological expertise accompanied economic activity, creating an empire not only of possessions but of influence, expectation, and structured interaction. The sea lanes themselves became part of the fabric of imperial life, carrying knowledge, ideas, and the subtle weight of authority to distant shores. Governance, though exercised from afar, was shaped by a philosophy that combined moral justification with administrative pragmatism. The ethical framework that underpinned Victorian domestic and cultural life extended into imperial policy. The belief that authority must be exercised responsibly, with attention to welfare, education, and moral guidance, informed the structure of colonial administration. Schools, hospitals, legal systems, and civic institutions were introduced alongside taxation, defense, and trade regulation, producing a complex network in which power, order, and ethical oversight were intended to coexist. Though the realities of empire were uneven and sometimes harsh, the deliberate cultivation of governance reflected a broader cultural commitment to measured authority and moral responsibility. Communication between the metropole and distant colonies relied on methodical networks. Telegraph lines, postal services, and periodic dispatches ensured that governors, officers, and administrators could transmit reports, receive instructions, and coordinate actions across vast distances. These systems, though slower than the instantaneous communication of the modern era, embodied a careful integration of technology, human labor, and planning, reflecting the Victorian penchant for organization, documentation, and thoughtful oversight. Decisions made in London could ripple across continents, influencing local economies, social structures, and cultural practices, demonstrating the interconnection of domestic governance and global responsibility. Cultural influence accompanied material and administrative reach. British educational models, language, legal codes, and artistic sensibilities were introduced alongside commerce and governance, producing subtle but pervasive changes in social norms, institutional structures, and daily life. Architecture, from administrative buildings to rail stations and churches, reflected both aesthetic ideals and functional purposes, conveying the values of order, refinement, and moral propriety. Literature, periodicals, and reports circulating in the colonies reinforced these standards, creating shared frameworks of understanding and expectation, and integrating diverse populations into a broader imperial consciousness. The moral justification of empire, articulated in speeches, writings, and policy frameworks, emphasized the intertwined responsibilities of governance, welfare, and civilization. Administrators, missionaries, and even soldiers were encouraged to view their work as an ethical endeavor, in which authority and influence carried obligations to guide, educate, and protect. This perspective, though sometimes unevenly applied, reflected the Victorian integration of moral cultivation with public responsibility, echoing principles evident within domestic life and the royal household. The monarchy itself, as a symbol of stability, virtue, and continuity, reinforced the ethical dimension of imperial oversight, projecting an image of stewardship and conscientious authority across vast and diverse territories. Trade, administration, and cultural influence were conducted with a careful attention to ceremony, protocol, and public perception. Governors, officials, and military officers were trained not only in technical skills but in the subtleties of conduct, the nuances of negotiation, and the expectations of moral propriety. Diplomatic relations with local leaders, treaties, and ceremonial exchanges were orchestrated with meticulous planning, reflecting a broader cultural emphasis on balance, dignity, and measured engagement. In these acts, the empire projected both power and refinement, demonstrating that influence could be exercised with a combination of authority, decorum, and moral attention. The impact of empire was also visible in the slow transformation of metropolitan life. Trade revenues, access to raw materials, and cultural exchange shaped urban development, industrial expansion, and domestic consumption. Products from distant colonies filled markets and households, while news of distant events stimulated public reflection and debate. Newspapers, journals, and periodicals chronicled life across the empire, reinforcing awareness of interconnectedness, responsibility, and the subtle moral and ethical dimensions of global reach. The empire, though distant, became a quiet yet persistent presence in the rhythms of everyday life, a testament to the interplay of labor, governance, and moral oversight. By the later decades of the 19th century, Britain's global dominion was marked by a sense of both grandeur and responsibility. The empire encompassed diverse territories, peoples, and ecosystems, each subject to the rhythms of administration, trade, and cultural influence. Yet even as power extended across continents, the Victorian approach emphasized order, ethical engagement, and careful reflection. The empire was not simply a matter of conquest, it was a sustained effort to integrate authority, moral guidance, and measured oversight, producing a global presence that mirrored the values cultivated within the palace, the household, and the domestic sphere. Within this quiet expansion, the monarchy retained its symbolic centrality. Victoria's engagement with the empire, though often mediated through correspondence, reports, and counsel, reflected an awareness of both human and administrative responsibility. Her public and private attention to imperial matters underscored the notion that dominion was inseparable from duty, and that the exercise of authority carried both ethical and practical obligations. In this way, the sun of Britain's empire, metaphorically never setting, was accompanied by a persistent moral and administrative vigilance, ensuring that the reach of power was tempered by reflection, order, and conscientious oversight. As Britain's influence stretched across continents, and the empire's reach appeared almost limitless, the pulse of life at home, particularly in London, offered a more immediate and intimate portrait of the Victorian age. The capital, ever expanding and evolving, was a living organism, its streets, buildings, and inhabitants intertwined in a delicate yet persistent rhythm. Cobblestones, gaslit thoroughfares, and the misty fog rising from the Thames created a sensory tapestry through which the story of urban life unfolded, reflecting both the triumphs and the challenges of industrial, social, and cultural transformation. London's streets were at once crowded and measured, bustling yet disciplined, as carriages rolled over uneven stones and pedestrians navigated narrow alleys alongside widened boulevards. Gas lamps, newly installed along major thoroughfares, cast pools of soft illumination upon pavements, their steady glow transforming the night into a realm of quiet reflection rather than utter darkness. The flicker of flame and the gentle hiss of the lamps became familiar companions, lending the city an air of both mystery and order, a rhythm that guided citizens through the hours of evening and night. Fog, dense and shifting, added another layer to the sensory environment. It rose from the river, curling through alleys and enveloping buildings in a soft silvery haze. The fog muffled sound, blurring the distinctions between voices, wheels, and the distant toll of church bells. Within this atmospheric veil, the city's structures appeared both grand and transient, towers and spires emerging from obscurity only to dissolve again into the mist. Citizens moved cautiously yet confidently through this environment, their routines adapted to the caprices of weather, time, and industrial activity, their presence a quiet testimony to resilience amidst a constantly shifting landscape. Infrastructure expanded in measured increments, reflecting both the demands of population growth and the innovations of industrial technology. Railways, bridges, and new roads extended the reach of commerce and daily life, linking districts once separated by distance and creating networks of connection and circulation. Water and sewage systems, slowly improved over decades, sought to contain the practical realities of urban density, while markets, workshops, and public buildings exemplified both architectural refinement and functional purpose. The city in this sense was a self-regulating organism, streets and neighborhoods, institutions and thoroughfares, each performing roles that contributed to the ongoing life of London. Beneath this structural complexity, the people of London moved with quiet resilience. Laborers, clerks, artisans, and merchants navigated their daily routines with a combination of diligence and adaptability. Women and children participated in both domestic and economic life, their presence felt in homes, markets, and streets alike. The rhythms of industry and domesticity interwove, factory whistles signaled shifts in labor, church bells marked hours of reflection, and the steady movement of goods and services facilitated the continuity of life. Even amid overcrowding, hardship, and occasional disease, Londoners developed an almost imperceptible harmony with the urban organism, their routines sustaining the life of the city much as the circulation of blood sustains the body. Public spaces reflected the Victorian emphasis on order, morality, and aesthetic sensibility. Parks, squares, and promenades offered respite from the density of streets and tenements, carefully landscaped to provide beauty, air, and quiet contemplation. Fountains, statues, and ornamental gardens conveyed civic pride and cultural refinement, reinforcing the ethical and aesthetic values that underpinned social life. Within these spaces, citizens could observe one another, exchange conversation, or reflect in solitude, experiencing the city both as a functional environment and as a canvas upon which the ideals of order, civility, and decorum were subtly inscribed. Transportation, though often mechanized, maintained a rhythm that was at once orderly and adaptable. Horse-drawn omnibuses, cabriolets, and carts moved along fixed routes, guided by conductors and drivers who balanced efficiency with caution. Steam trains brought travelers and goods into the city from distant towns, their arrival punctuating the day with a sense of continuity and connection. Even the more chaotic elements of traffic, the clatter of wheels, the occasional shout, the unpredictability of weather, were absorbed into a larger pattern of urban life, integrated into a city that functioned as both a machine and an organism, evolving yet coherent, complex yet intelligible to those who moved within it. Markets, workshops, and industrial districts added texture to the cityscape. The smell of coal, the sizzle of furnaces, and the rhythmic pounding of hammers filled the air in particular quarters, blending with the more delicate aromas of bakeries, dairies, and flowering gardens in residential neighborhoods. Citizens, in turn, navigated these sensory landscapes with practiced attention, developing a tacit understanding of when and where to move, when to pause, and how to integrate their routines with the larger flow of commerce and social interaction. Even the densest and most impoverished neighborhoods displayed forms of resilience, adaptation, and subtle ingenuity, as citizens balanced labor, domestic duties, and social interaction amidst the pressures of urban density. London's architectural evolution further reflected the interplay between grandeur and intimacy. Gothic spires, neoclassical facades, and newly constructed terraces created a layered urban environment in which the past and present coexisted. Churches, civic buildings, and museums expressed both moral and cultural ideals, while residential streets and tenements revealed the practical realities of housing a rapidly expanding population. Each structure contributed to the rhythm of the city, guiding movement, framing perception, and influencing the daily experience of its inhabitants. The city in this sense was simultaneously a functional organism, a moral landscape, and an aesthetic composition, its character emerging from the interaction of space, material, and human presence. The interplay of light and shadow, movement and stillness, sound and silence, created a subtle drama that unfolded over hours, days, and seasons. Morning mist gave way to afternoon sun, while evening gaslights drew citizens from streets to homes, theaters, and places of reflection. Seasonal shifts transformed the city's character, as rain, snow, and summer warmth interacted with stone, brick, and water to create constantly changing atmospheres. Within these rhythms, Londoners adapted with quiet fortitude, their lives synchronized to both natural and constructed cycles, participating in the ongoing vitality of a metropolis that was at once formidable and intimate, imposing and familiar. Beneath all this movement and transformation lay a profound sense of endurance and continuity. Generations of families, institutions, and tradespeople maintained their routines with patience and resilience, sustaining the life of the city despite occasional upheavals, economic fluctuations, and social challenges. The rhythm of labor, education, religion, and domesticity continued, creating patterns that were invisible yet persistent, shaping experience and perception in ways that were at once subtle and essential. The city itself, ever responsive to its inhabitants and the pressures of modernity, absorbed these patterns, becoming an organism in which life, industry, culture, and moral expectation were continuously interwoven. In the quiet observation of London's fogged streets, gaslit squares, and resilient populace, one could perceive the essential character of Victorian urban life. The city was a reflection of the nation's ambitions, anxieties, and achievements, a complex network of movement, structure, and ethical awareness. Its grandeur was balanced by the intimacy of domestic routines, its density tempered by gardens and public spaces, and its complexity navigated by citizens whose quiet endurance and adaptability sustained the organism through decades of change. As London's streets pulsed with the rhythms of daily life, and the grand sweep of empire reached distant continents, another current quietly shaped the character of Victorian Britain, the slow, deliberate tide of social and political reform. Change did not arrive as sudden upheaval or violent disruption, but as a measured, almost imperceptible shift in the structures of law, labor, and civic responsibility. The population, increasingly aware of its collective voice and moral imperative, began to influence governance and society through gradual legislative progress, creating a dialogue between authority and citizenry that unfolded over decades with patience, deliberation, and moral reflection. One of the most visible arenas of reform concerned labor, particularly the protection of children in industrial settings. Factories, workshops, and mines had grown rapidly in response to the demands of production, often employing young children under conditions that by modern standards were harsh and dangerous. Public attention, initially drawn by careful observation, inquiry, and journalism, gradually coalesced into legislative action. Laws were introduced to regulate working hours, provide minimal education, and establish safety standards, each measure reflecting a moral and practical acknowledgement of responsibility toward the young and vulnerable. These reforms were not dramatic in their immediate effect, but their cumulative impact slowly transformed the rhythms of industrial life, altering daily routines and reinforcing the Victorian ideal that progress must be balanced with ethical stewardship. Parallel to labor reform, the political landscape evolved through measured legislative adjustment. The Reform Acts, beginning in 1832 and continuing with subsequent expansions in 1867 and 1884, slowly broadened suffrage, redefined constituencies, and incrementally increased the participation of middle and working class citizens in the governance of the nation. Each act was the product of debate, compromise, and observation, reflecting a cautious approach to political change that prioritized stability while acknowledging evolving expectations. Citizens' engagement, though gradual, created a moral and civic rhythm in which representation and responsibility became intertwined, fostering the quiet awakening of democratic consciousness without abrupt disruption to social or institutional order. Education, too, emerged as a locus of reform, reflecting the Victorian belief in moral cultivation, practical knowledge, and the potential of informed citizens to contribute to society. Schools, both state-supported and privately organized, proliferated throughout urban and rural districts, providing instruction not only in reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also in ethics, civics, and practical skills. The expansion of literacy and access to knowledge subtly reshaped social interaction, enabling citizens to participate more fully in public discourse, understand legislative developments, and reflect on both local and imperial matters. The growth of education, like other forms of reform, was deliberate and measured, emphasizing the integration of learning with moral and practical responsibility. The press and public discussion played a complementary role, quietly shaping awareness and opinion. Newspapers, journals, and pamphlets circulated information about legislation, social conditions, and ethical debates, often blending detailed reportage with reflection and commentary. Citizens engaged with these sources in domestic, professional, and civic spaces, absorbing insights, forming opinions, and participating in a slow dialogue that gradually influenced the trajectory of governance. The spread of information, like industrial or educational reform, proceeded in careful increments, reinforcing the Victorian ideal that change was most effective when guided by reflection, reason, and moral consideration. Resistance naturally accompanied reform. Established interests, entrenched social hierarchies, and institutional inertia often slowed progress, requiring advocates of change to employ persistence, evidence, and negotiation rather than confrontation alone. Debates over child labor, electoral reform, and public education were marked by meticulous argumentation, careful observation of outcomes, and appeals to moral and civic responsibility. In this environment, the voice of the people emerged not as a clamorous upheaval, but as a continuous deliberate pressure, guiding policy, shaping legislation, and gradually extending ethical and practical considerations into every corner of daily life. Industrial towns and rural districts alike reflected the interplay of reform and resistance. Factories modified schedules, introduced safety measures, and provided rudimentary schooling for children, while workers and families adjusted routines, habits, and expectations in response to new regulations. Communities engaged in local governance, debates, and philanthropic initiatives, integrating ethical reflection with practical action. The cumulative effect of these adjustments, though subtle, produced a quiet transformation of social patterns, labor expectations, and civic consciousness, demonstrating the Victorian ideal that reform could be achieved through deliberation, observation, and steady moral engagement. The monarchy, while largely symbolic in these domestic reforms, provided a stabilizing moral presence that reinforced the ethos of measured change. Victoria's continued attention to education, moral cultivation, and social welfare, coupled with the structured visibility of the royal household, offered both example and reassurance to citizens. The monarchy's role, subtle yet persistent, exemplified the Victorian belief that authority could guide, observe, and influence without coercion, supporting reform while maintaining continuity and stability. Philanthropy and social engagement complemented legislative measures. Charitable organizations, often supported or patronized by members of the royal family and the aristocracy, addressed practical needs arising from urban growth, industrialization, and social inequality. Relief for the poor, the establishment of orphanages, and the support of medical institutions reflected the integration of moral principle with pragmatic concern. These efforts, like legislative reform, proceeded with care and deliberation, embedding social conscience into the very structures of Victorian life. Throughout this period, the quiet expansion of political, social, and educational participation reinforced the broader ethos of responsibility, reflection, and measured progress. Citizens from the laboring classes to the professional elite were gradually incorporated into the processes of governance, ethical consideration, and civic engagement. The pace of change, though slow by modern standards, allowed society to adapt, internalize principles, and integrate new expectations into established routines, producing a sense of continuity amidst transformation. Ultimately, the tide of reform, though deliberate and often contested, reshaped Victorian life in profound ways. Labor protections, expanded suffrage, and the growth of education altered daily experience, moral expectations, and civic consciousness. Citizens moved through industrial towns, cities, and rural villages in patterns informed by law, social expectation, and ethical reflection. Political representation, though incomplete, became an accepted rhythm of governance, reinforcing the notion that responsibility, deliberation, and moral awareness were inseparable from progress. In this calm and measured evolution, the Victorian era demonstrated the interplay of observation, reflection, and action. Change was neither abrupt nor chaotic. it emerged from careful attention to experience, evidence, and ethical principle. The voice of the people, expressed through incremental legislation, civic participation, and social advocacy, harmonized with the broader rhythms of domestic life, industrial growth, and imperial responsibility. In doing so, it created a society in which reform and resistance coexisted, not as opposition, but as a subtle negotiation between tradition, moral obligation, and the slow, steady expansion of justice, opportunity, and civic awareness. As the rhythms of political reform and social awakening quietly reshaped the fabric of Victorian society, another, more intimate force permeated the consciousness of the nation: the written word. Letters, journals, newspapers, and the novels of a flourishing literary culture became threads that bound individuals across time, space, and social strata, offering insight into human emotion, social conditions, and moral reflection. In this age of letters, writers, thinkers, and dreamers cultivated a quiet intimacy with readers, shaping empathy, class awareness, and the subtle emotional textures that defined the century, all while the city streets, factories, and colonial outposts continued their steady rhythms. Charles Dickens, whose work often traced the intersecting lives of London's rich and poor, created literary spaces in which moral attention and social observation coexisted. His depictions of dense urban streets, workshops, and family homes revealed both hardship and resilience, portraying laborers, children, and artisans with empathy and careful detail. Novels such as Oliver Twist and David Copperfield were more than entertainment. They were deliberate examinations of society's inequities, presented with precision, narrative patience, and an awareness of the moral responsibilities of the reader. Through Dickens, the city, with its fog, gaslight, and human activity, became a living landscape of experience, inviting reflection on the consequences of industrial progress and social neglect. Parallel to Dickens, the Bronte sisters explored the interior landscapes of emotion and social expectation, constructing worlds in which family, morality, and individual agency intersected. The moors, the households, and the remote settings of their novels evoked a calm intensity, combining detailed description with ethical reflection. Characters navigated social constraints, personal grief, and moral dilemmas, offering readers a model of introspection and emotional engagement. Through the quiet drama of the narrative, the Brontes illuminated the inner lives of individuals, demonstrating how personal experience, ethical consideration, and societal pressures were intricately interwoven. Alfred, Lord Tennyson, in poetry that moved slowly across the reader's consciousness. His verses, whether contemplating the heroic past, the mysteries of nature, or the moral condition of humanity, carried the reader into extended periods of thought, attention, and quiet contemplation. Tennyson's work exemplified the Victorian ideal that literature was not only aesthetic but moral, a vehicle through which reflection, empathy, and ethical awareness could be cultivated across the span of individual and collective experience. The cadence of his lines, measured and deliberate, encouraged the reader to linger on meaning, sensation, and moral implication, reinforcing the subtle rhythm of thought and feeling that characterized the age. The proliferation of periodicals, journals, and serialized fiction created additional layers of connectivity, extending the reach of literary influence to both urban centers and rural communities. Newspapers and magazines provided accounts of current events, essays on philosophy, serialized novels, and moral commentary, circulating knowledge, opinion, and aesthetic sensibility widely. Citizens, reading in parlors, libraries, or informal study spaces, absorbed narratives and reflections that reinforced social awareness, ethical engagement, and cultural literacy. In these texts, the rhythms of daily life, industry, and empire were often refracted through observation, narrative, and reflection, allowing readers to engage with both the immediate and the distant in measured, contemplative ways. Philosophers, historians, and scientific writers contributed to the same ethos, extending the reach of literature beyond fiction. Treatises on ethics, explorations of natural history, and reflections on social conditions combined intellectual rigor with moral concern, offering readers frameworks for understanding the complex interactions of industrialization, empire, and social change. The works of thinkers such as John Stuart Mill, for example, examined questions of liberty, representation, and responsibility, providing intellectual tools for reflection upon civic and moral life. In the Victorian imagination, literature, philosophy, and observation were not separate domains. They converged in a continuum of ethical, emotional, and intellectual cultivation. Letters, both private and public, provided additional intimacy and connectivity. Families separated by distance, colonial administrators and governors, and citizens within towns and cities alike engaged in written exchange, sustaining personal bonds, moral instruction, and practical communication. The careful attention given to tone, phrasing, and content reflected the era's emphasis on reflection, propriety, and empathy. Letters bridged emotional and geographic distances, allowing for both the transmission of information and the cultivation of understanding, demonstrating that the act of writing itself was both practical and ethically significant. Literary salons, reading circles, and informal gatherings further facilitated the integration of text into the social and emotional fabric of life. Citizens, scholars, and the emerging middle class discussed novels, essays, and poems in measured discourse, reflecting on the human condition, social inequities, and moral responsibility. In these interactions, the written word was not only consumed but processed, interpreted, and integrated into daily consciousness, reinforcing the subtle, persistent interplay between literature, ethical reflection, and social awareness. In education, literature also played a formative role. Schools and tutors incorporated novels, poetry, and essays into instruction, encouraging both literacy and ethical reflection. Students encountered texts designed to cultivate empathy, moral discernment, and a sense of responsibility, reinforcing the Victorian belief that intellectual and emotional development were inseparable. Through reading, young citizens absorbed the rhythms of urban life, the challenges of social inequality, and the contemplations of ethical behavior, internalizing both narrative and moral principle in a slow, deliberate process. Ultimately, the literary flowering of the Victorian age was not only a reflection of aesthetic achievement, but a vehicle for the cultivation of conscience, perception, and civic awareness. Through Dickens, the Brontes, Tennyson, and countless others, readers were invited to inhabit the lives of those beyond their immediate experience, to reflect on social and moral conditions, and to engage in ethical contemplation. Letters, essays, and journals reinforced these sensibilities, linking private thought with public observation, domestic experience with global awareness. The age of letters, in this sense, was a quiet force, shaping the ethical and emotional fabric of a society already navigating industrial, political, and imperial transformations. It offered citizens, young and old, intimate encounters with empathy, moral reasoning, and social reflection, extending the rhythms of thought, observation, and ethical cultivation into daily life. The interplay of narrative, description, and reflection encouraged readers to slow their perception, consider consequences, and integrate understanding into their conduct, producing a culture in which literature was inseparable from the shaping of character and conscience. As the literary world expanded, minds and industrial engines reshaped streets and towns, the quiet evolution of social roles, particularly the experience of women, unfolded with measured deliberation throughout Victorian Britain. The period was defined not only by sweeping technological, imperial, and cultural transformations, but also by the subtler, persistent negotiation of expectation, propriety, and moral responsibility within the domestic sphere. Women from the grand halls of the palace to the modest terraces of industrial towns inhabited lives structured by a complex interplay of ideals, limitations, and gradually emerging opportunities, navigating a world bound by decorum and yet stirred by the first currents of change. The ideal of Victorian womanhood, deeply ingrained in domestic, cultural, and moral consciousness, emphasized refinement, moral guidance, and nurturing responsibility. From an early age, girls were educated in the virtues of decorum, piety, and household management, instructed in skills ranging from embroidery and music to moral reflection and social etiquette. In middle and upper-class households, domestic spaces became arenas in which ethical cultivation, aesthetic sensibility, and intellectual curiosity were carefully cultivated. Women were expected to act as moral anchors within the family, guiding children, supervising servants, and maintaining the harmonious rhythms of home life, their influence profound though often invisible beyond the threshold of private quarters. The Queen herself embodied aspects of this ideal, balancing personal grief, public duty, and the careful cultivation of a moral household. Victoria's management of her domestic environment, from the ordering of her children's education to the orchestration of household routines, reflected broader cultural expectations for women in positions of influence. Her comportment, reserved, dignified, attentive, offered a model of female authority that was both moral and practical, subtly reinforcing the notion that women could wield quiet yet consequential power, shaping both private life and public perception through virtue and careful oversight. Yet alongside the cultivation of domestic ideals, the Victorian era also saw the first stirrings of change and challenge to traditional gender roles. Education for girls, while initially focused on moral, aesthetic, and domestic instruction, gradually expanded to include literacy, mathematics, and scientific knowledge. Institutions, both philanthropic and private, began offering formal instruction, preparing young women for broader engagement with intellectual, professional, and civic life. These changes, subtle yet persistent, reflected the belief that moral and intellectual cultivation could coexist with traditional expectations, creating pathways for gradual empowerment without undermining prevailing social norms. Work outside the domestic sphere, though constrained by social convention, also presented evolving opportunities. Women increasingly participated in teaching, nursing, writing, and charitable endeavors, carving spaces in which labor, skill, and moral attention intersected. Nursing in particular gained prominence through the example of figures like Florence Nightingale, whose methodical attention to hygiene, patient care, and administration elevated both professional standards and public perception of female capability. In these roles, women combined practical skill with ethical responsibility, demonstrating that their influence extended beyond domestic confines, quietly shaping social, medical, and institutional life with the same attention to order and propriety that defined private households. The slow emergence of suffrage and political awareness added another dimension to the changing feminine ideal. Early campaigns for voting rights, property recognition, and civic participation moved cautiously within public consciousness, often framed in terms of moral stewardship and ethical responsibility rather than radical disruption. Advocacy for women's education, professional engagement, and legal rights reflected a deliberate engagement with societal structures, emphasizing that influence could be exerted with patience, reflection, and moral consistency. In this way, women's expanding public presence complemented their domestic roles, gradually integrating broader spheres of action into established rhythms of social expectation. Literature and cultural representation further codified and contested the feminine ideal. Novels, poetry, and periodicals depicted women as moral guides, domestic anchors, and emotional centers, while simultaneously exploring tensions, desires, and aspirations that extended beyond conventional boundaries. The Bronte sisters, George Eliot, and other writers presented female characters who navigated constraint and possibility, combining intelligence, resilience, and ethical deliberation in ways that subtly questioned traditional roles. Readers, both male and female, absorbed these depictions with care, reflecting on the interplay of expectation, opportunity, and individual capacity, and incorporating these insights into personal and social consciousness. Philanthropy, charitable societies, and religious organizations offered additional avenues through which women exercised influence. assistance for the poor, organization of educational programs, and involvement in healthcare initiatives reflected the integration of moral responsibility with practical action. These endeavors, while socially sanctioned, allowed women to engage with the broader world, shaping public life through quiet, disciplined activity. The rhythm of participation, planning, overseeing, instructing, and reflecting mirrored the domestic ideals of organization, propriety, and ethical cultivation, demonstrating that influence could be extended into civic and social domains without abandoning the ethical and aesthetic priorities of home life. Marriage and family life remained central to the feminine ideal, but the Victorian approach emphasized negotiation, education, and moral oversight as critical elements of domestic practice. Women were expected to supervise child-rearing, manage household affairs, and guide social interactions, while also maintaining personal conduct that reflected virtue, patience, and discernment. Within these frameworks, subtle power and influence were exercised, shaping domestic routines, the education of children, and even the moral climate of households, all in accordance with prevailing standards of propriety and ethical reflection. Even as these domestic and social expectations persisted, Victorian women began to inhabit a more complex moral and practical landscape. The interplay of tradition and innovation, observation and action, domestic responsibility and public engagement created spaces in which gradual change could take root. Education, professional opportunity, literary participation, and charitable engagement became instruments through which women cultivated influence, exercised judgment, and participated in the slow evolution of societal norms. These developments unfolded over decades, advancing the cause of gender awareness without disrupting the broader rhythms of propriety and ethical reflection that structured the era. Ultimately, the Victorian feminine ideal was defined by a careful balance of tradition, moral cultivation, and emerging opportunity. Women's lives were structured by decorum, domestic responsibility, and social expectation, yet simultaneously shaped by the gradual expansion of intellectual, professional, and civic engagement. This interplay of continuity and change, observation and action, domesticity and emerging public presence, produced a nuanced landscape in which women's influence extended across private and public spheres, quietly shaping the ethical, cultural, and social dimensions of the century. In the calm deliberation of these developments, the Victorian era demonstrates the subtle but persistent evolution of gender roles. Women navigating constraints and expectations expanded the boundaries of education, labor, and civic participation, while maintaining the moral and aesthetic coherence that defined domestic life. Their influence, though often quiet and disciplined, was pervasive, shaping the texture of households, the rhythms of cities, and the moral consciousness of a society, negotiating the balance between tradition and progress. Beneath the grandeur of ceremonial processions, industrial innovation, and the steady expansion of British dominion, there existed another, quieter dimension of the Victorian era, one shaped not by triumph, but by the complex, often unseen consequences of imperial authority. The colonies, sprawling across continents from India to Africa, were landscapes of both resource and human resilience, where the rhythms of daily life, tradition, and cultural identity met the steady imposition of British administration, commerce, and social expectation. The vast reach of empire, while a source of national pride in London or Edinburgh, was mirrored by nuanced moral and ethical dilemmas in the lands under colonial rule, where lives were transformed, traditions disrupted, and societies quietly reconfigured. India, as the centerpiece of the British Empire, exemplified the multifaceted nature of this intersection. The subcontinent's cities, villages, and regions bore the imprint of administration, taxation, and the integration of local governance with imperial oversight. Railways threaded across plains and mountains, connecting administrative centers to ports, markets, and resource zones, while telegraph lines facilitated the transmission of orders, news, and observation across vast distances. These technological and administrative networks were intended to stabilize governance, enhance commerce, and extend British influence, yet they also altered rhythms of life, disrupted local economies, and imposed unfamiliar social hierarchies. The introduction of legal codes, often adapted from British models, intersected with long-standing traditions, creating spaces of negotiation, tension, and occasional cultural dissonance. Economic pressures, while subtle in their daily manifestations, exerted profound effects on local populations. The cultivation of cash crops for export, the restructuring of trade systems, and the imposition of taxes altered the livelihoods of farmers, artisans, and merchants. While some individuals benefited from integration into global markets, many communities faced scarcity, displacement, or economic vulnerability. Famine, such as the devastating Bengal famine of 1876-78, highlighted the limits of administrative foresight and the sometimes tragic consequences of distant governance, producing slow, deep, and pervasive suffering that contrasted sharply with the orderly confidence projected by imperial authorities in London. In Africa, the dynamics of expansion were shaped by both geography and cultural diversity. Coastal settlements, inland protectorates, and newly mapped territories were sites of commerce, negotiation, and occasional conflict. Missionaries and colonial officials, guided by the Victorian ethos of moral responsibility, sought to introduce education, religion, and healthcare alongside the management of trade and defense. Yet these interventions were not experienced as neutral or universally beneficial. Local traditions, leadership structures, and social customs often met external initiatives with careful adaptation, resistance, or negotiation. The collision of cultures unfolded slowly, with subtle disruptions in patterns of governance, social hierarchy, and daily life reverberating across generations. Sanitation, another quiet but profound transformation, reshaped the lived environment of urban centers. The dense fog, industrial smoke, and accumulated detritus of cities had long contributed to disease, discomfort, and the disruption of daily life. Systematic improvements in sewage systems, water supply, and waste management, often achieved through the painstaking efforts of engineers and public health officials, introduced hygiene, order, and moral reassurance into previously chaotic urban landscapes. Citizens gradually adjusted their daily routines to accommodate these improvements, experiencing both practical benefits and a deeper sense of ethical engagement with the collective welfare of the city. The rhythms of bathing, cooking, and domestic maintenance were subtly restructured, reflecting the integration of technological innovation with moral consciousness and social expectation. Industrial machinery, ever present in factories and workshops, created a steady, measured hum that became part of the auditory landscape of Victorian life. Steam engines, spinning frames, textile looms, and other apparatus demanded coordination, observation, and attention, producing both labor-intensive work and a quiet spectacle of progress. The sounds of industry, though occasionally oppressive, also conveyed achievement, human ingenuity, and the rhythmic integration of technology into social and economic life. Workers adapted to these patterns with patience, skill, and resilience, their movements synchronized with mechanical rhythms that combined efficiency with discipline, producing a harmonious yet morally attentive engagement with the tools of progress. Transportation, closely intertwined with technological innovation, further shaped urban and rural life. Railways, canals, and bridges facilitated commerce, travel, and communication, linking regions and reducing isolation. The quiet excitement of arrival and departure, the steady passage of goods and people, and the meticulous coordination of schedules reflected an era in which movement was increasingly ordered, predictable, and efficient. Travelers experienced both the exhilaration of speed and the reflection that such transformation required ethical consideration. The efficient movement of goods and individuals was inseparable from questions of safety, labor conditions, and social consequence. Medical advances, quietly unfolding alongside industrial and domestic improvements, reshaped the human experience in intimate ways. Public awareness of sanitation, hygiene, and germ theory, slowly influenced domestic practice, medical instruction, and hospital administration. Innovations in surgery, anesthesia, and diagnostics introduced new possibilities while demanding moral reflection on the responsibilities of practitioners and patients alike. Disease prevention, treatment, and observation became part of the broader ethical and practical landscape, integrating scientific discovery with social expectation and personal responsibility. Citizens incorporated these lessons into domestic routines, health practices, and communal life, demonstrating the subtle interplay of progress and conscience that characterized the Victorian imagination. Scientific research and public display of invention created spaces for both contemplation and admiration. Exhibitions, lectures, and demonstrations offered glimpses of potential and innovation, often combining aesthetic presentation with practical explanation. These events, like the Great Exhibition of 1851 decades earlier, emphasized the moral and civic responsibilities accompanying knowledge. Progress was not simply technical achievement, but a reflection of societal priorities, ethical awareness, and careful observation of consequence. Spectators absorbed the quiet rhythm of invention, observing cause, effect, and application with the deliberate attention characteristic of the era. The human dimension of empire extended beyond policy and administration. Soldiers, civil servants, and traders navigated unfamiliar climates, social systems, and ethical contexts, their work requiring both observation and moral judgment. Local populations, in turn, adapted to changing expectations, economic pressures, and institutional structures, often preserving traditions while incorporating elements of colonial administration or culture. The resulting interplay was neither wholly harmonious nor entirely conflictual. It was a subtle negotiation of identity, responsibility, and survival, shaped by the rhythms of daily labor, social obligation, and personal resilience. Ethical reflection, quietly pursued by administrators, intellectuals, and even the monarchy, accompanied these practical challenges. The Victorian ideal of responsible authority, rooted in morality, education, and a sense of duty, was tested by the complexities of governance across diverse cultural and geographic landscapes. Questions of justice, intervention, and ethical responsibility emerged repeatedly, from debates over taxation, labor, and legal reform, to consideration of famine relief, public health, and social welfare. These deliberations unfolded with measured attention, balancing the desire for order and influence with the recognition of human cost and the limitations of distant oversight. Communication and documentation, central to the administration of empire, further illuminated these tensions. Letters, dispatches, reports, and observations transmitted from colonial outposts provided detailed accounts of social, economic, and cultural life, offering guidance, reflection, and warning to those in authority. These records often conveyed the quiet suffering of populations alongside evidence of resilience and adaptation, revealing a complex, layered reality in which the exercise of power was inseparable from moral responsibility. Through such correspondence, distant observers could engage with the lived experience of empire, recognizing both achievement and consequence, even as physical separation constrained direct intervention. Cultural consequences, often subtle and enduring, shaped both the colonized and the colonizers. Traditional practices, legal norms, and social hierarchies intersected with British models of education, governance, and social expectation, producing hybridized systems that blended continuity with change. Language, ritual, and artistic expression were influenced by exposure to new ideas, materials, and administrative structures, creating a dialogue between inherited culture and imposed frameworks. Over decades, this interaction produced societies that retained essential identity while navigating the ethical and practical imperatives of colonial integration. Resistance and adaptation, often imperceptible in the grand narrative of empire, formed another layer of the colonial experience. Local leaders, communities, and individuals negotiated authority, maintained traditions, and occasionally challenged policies in ways that required subtle diplomacy and careful management. Rebellions, protests, and social negotiation, while sporadic, highlighted the limits of distant authority and the ongoing negotiation between imposed systems and lived experience. These interactions, conducted over months, years, and decades, contributed to the evolving texture of empire, demonstrating that even in hierarchically ordered structures, human agency persisted, quietly shaping outcomes and moral understanding. The shadow of empire was therefore composed of many dimensions: economic transformation, cultural collision, moral responsibility, and human resilience. Beneath the outward confidence of London's imperial narrative lay the intricate, often painful realities of societies adapting to distant oversight, technological intervention, and ethical imposition. Citizens and subjects alike participated in rhythms of accommodation, negotiation, and reflection, creating an undercurrent of experience that contrasted with the ceremonial splendor and industrial triumph celebrated in metropolitan centers. Ultimately, the Victorian Empire was a complex organism in which triumph and cost, order and dislocation, authority and moral responsibility were inseparably intertwined. The quiet suffering and subtle adaptation of colonial populations, the moral reflection of administrators, and the steady rhythms of trade and governance collectively defined the human dimensions of expansion. The sun may have metaphorically never set on Britain, yet the shadows of empire stretched across continents, shaping lives, perceptions, and ethical understanding in ways that demanded both awareness and deliberate reflection. While the shadows of empire quietly stretched across continents, shaping distant societies with subtle complexity, the domestic and metropolitan heart of Britain pulsed with another kind of transformation, one that merged ingenuity, comfort, and ethical reflection. The Victorian era, a period of extraordinary technological expansion, witnessed the deliberate, measured introduction of innovations that altered daily life, industry, communication, and public infrastructure. These advances, though exciting in promise, were accompanied by a calm, reflective unease, a recognition that progress, while beneficial, required thoughtful integration into the moral and social rhythms of society. At the forefront of this technological symphony was the advent of new modes of communication, the telegraph serving as the quiet, persistent conductor of distant connections. Telegraph lines stretched from urban centers to provincial towns, across oceans, and even to colonial outposts, transmitting information, orders, and news at speeds previously unimaginable. The hum of electrical currents became a silent companion to the rhythms of commerce, administration, and personal correspondence, knitting together the disparate parts of an expanding empire, while subtly transforming perceptions of time, distance, and responsibility. Messages that once traveled for weeks now arrived in hours, and the gentle acceleration of knowledge brought both convenience and an awareness of new ethical and operational obligations. Simultaneously, domestic and public spaces experienced gradual illumination through the introduction of gas and later, electric light. Streets, homes, and public buildings were no longer reliant solely on candles or oil lamps. Pools of soft, steady light extended hours of activity, altered social habits, and reshaped the nocturnal character of cities. The glow of lamplight, and eventually, electrical illumination softened the boundaries between night and day, producing a subtle psychological and practical impact on citizens. While light promised comfort, safety, and aesthetic enhancement, it also demanded reflection on the rhythms of labor, rest, and domesticity, subtly reminding observers that technological advancement carried responsibilities as well as benefits. Even the domestic sphere, so central to Victorian ideals, experienced subtle transformation under the influence of invention. Household appliances, lighting, heating, and plumbing systems altered daily routines, creating time for reflection, leisure, and education previously constrained by labor-intensive tasks. Women, while maintaining domestic oversight and moral authority, integrated these technologies into ethical and practical frameworks, balancing efficiency with propriety and comfort with attentiveness to the needs of family and household staff. The hum of machinery, the flicker of light and the steady flow of water became part of the sensory fabric of life, reshaping perception and expectation while maintaining continuity with traditional rhythms of domesticity and care. Yet technological advancement also carried unease. New machines displaced labor, altered social structures, and introduced risks both visible and subtle. Citizens, administrators, and industrialists alike grappled with questions of ethical oversight, equity, and the moral implications of progress. The gentle tension between excitement and reflection, benefit and responsibility, became part of the contemplative atmosphere of the century, reminding observers that innovation, while desirable, required deliberation, observation, and ethical engagement to harmonize with the broader rhythms of life. Ultimately, the technological symphony of the Victorian era, electric light, telegraphs, sanitation, machinery and transportation, was not a force imposed from without, but a careful integration into the moral, domestic and civic fabric of society. The steady hum of progress, observed, reflected upon, and integrated into daily experience, conveyed both comfort and subtle conscience, producing a century that learned to measure the benefits of innovation against the responsibilities it entailed. In the rhythm of invention, a careful balance emerged between achievement, reflection, and ethical engagement, echoing the broader Victorian emphasis on order, propriety, and conscientious participation in the unfolding drama of modern life. As the hum of machinery, the flicker of gas and electric light, and the rhythmic cadence of telegraphs became familiar features of everyday life, the figure of Queen Victoria herself moved into the later stages of her reign, embodying the endurance, reflection, and continuity that had come to define the Victorian era. Time had deepened her understanding of duty, enhanced the solemnity of her public presence, and transformed her from the young sovereign who had ascended the throne in her late teens into a living emblem of stability, majesty, and national identity. Her visibility, once withdrawn by personal grief, gradually returned, measured, deliberate, and infused with the quiet authority of experience. Victoria's later years were marked by ceremonial observances that both reflected and reinforced her symbolic authority. Jubilees, carefully orchestrated, provided occasions for the nation to witness the continuity of monarchy amidst profound social, technological, and political transformation. The Golden Jubilee of 1887, marking 50 years on the throne, and the Diamond Jubilee of 1897, celebrating 60, were events of meticulous planning, civic engagement, and reflective display. Streets were adorned with flags and banners, buildings illuminated with lanterns and early electric lighting, and citizens from urban centers to provincial towns participated in spectacles that balanced festivity with reverence. Through these observances, the Queen's presence served as both a unifying force and a contemplative symbol of enduring governance, bridging the private and public dimensions of authority. The Queen herself, aware of the weight of her position, conducted these appearances with measured composure. Her attire, often austere yet meticulously chosen, reflected both personal taste and an understanding of symbolic significance. The black garments she had worn during mourning gradually gave way to more ceremonial attire, yet her bearing, posture, and demeanor conveyed the memory of loss alongside the enduring presence of authority. In every gesture, from the carriage drawn through cheering streets to the careful acknowledgement of assembled dignitaries, she embodied the rhythm of continuity and reflection, blending public expectation with private contemplation. Victoria's later reign was also characterized by her role as an emblem of imperial identity. As Britain's colonies and dominions expanded, and as communication and travel linked distant lands, the Queen's image became a symbolic anchor, a representation of stability and moral authority across continents. Coins, stamps, portraits, and official documents bore her likeness, reinforcing a sense of cohesion and shared identity. Subjects in India, Africa, Canada, and Australasia encountered these symbols in both ceremonial and quotidian contexts, encountering a sovereign who was at once distant yet present, an enduring emblem of unity, governance, and ethical oversight. Alongside ceremonial visibility, the Queen maintained engagement with domestic and political affairs, though her methods were increasingly contemplative and advisory. Correspondence with ministers, colonial administrators, and heads of state reflected a combination of attention to detail, moral reflection, and practical understanding. Reports on legislation, social developments, and colonial conditions were read and considered with deliberate care, reinforcing the Queen's role as a stabilizing observer and ethically attuned participant in governance. Her attention to nuance, her patience in deliberation, and her awareness of consequence underscored the continuity of authority in a society transformed by technology, reform, and cultural evolution. The personal dimension of Victoria's later reign was equally significant. Family, once the center of domestic energy and moral instruction, became a source of reflection and continuity. Her children, married into European royal families, represented both personal achievement and strategic connection, extending influence and networks in ways that mirrored broader imperial concerns. Relationships, correspondence, and visits were conducted with careful attention to decorum, duty, and ethical expectation, reinforcing the domestic rhythms and moral sensibilities that had been cultivated over decades. In these interactions, the Queen balanced affection, oversight, and reflection, modeling the integration of personal life with public responsibility. Victoria's enduring visibility also influenced the broader cultural imagination. Artists, photographers, and writers captured her image and presence, producing portraits, illustrations, and textual accounts that reinforced the narrative of continuity, stability, and measured authority. Citizens, in observing these depictions, internalized the symbolic weight of her reign, associating the passage of decades with ethical reflection, resilience, and the capacity of institutions to endure. The Queen's embodiment of longevity, moral seriousness, and ceremonial propriety offered reassurance in a century marked by rapid change, industrial transformation, and social negotiation. Even as age advanced, Victoria maintained a rhythm of engagement with the institutions of governance and empire. The legislative process, ceremonial functions, and moral oversight were integrated into her daily life with the same deliberate pacing that had characterized her earlier years. Audiences with officials, review of reports, and attention to international correspondence were conducted with patience, reflection, and meticulous attention to detail, reinforcing the Queen's symbolic and practical authority while providing continuity across a century of change. Her jubilees, in particular, encapsulated the duality of public grandeur and reflective observation. Streets thronged with citizens moving in orderly patterns, ceremonial bands, and illuminated public spaces created spectacles of collective pride. Yet, amid the visual celebration, there existed a quieter contemplative awareness, the recognition that stability required observation, ethical engagement, and deliberate nurturing of institutions. Victoria, present yet measured, embodied this ethos, standing as both participant and observer, simultaneously symbol and guide for a society negotiating continuity and innovation. In the public eye, she became a moral anchor, a touchstone for cultural and national identity. Her presence communicated restraint, ethical awareness, and a commitment to service, reinforcing the values that had guided both private and public life throughout her reign. Citizens, observing from cities, towns, and rural landscapes, encountered a figure whose longevity, composure, and symbolic authority reflected the harmonious integration of tradition, innovation, and moral reflection. In this way, the Queen's later years were not merely chronological extension, but a deliberate cultivation of legacy, an embodiment of the measured, reflective power of sustained leadership. Ultimately, Victoria's later reign exemplified the integration of experience, reflection, and continuity. Through ceremonies, correspondence, family engagement, and public presence, she became an emblem of stability in a rapidly transforming world, embodying the rhythms of duty, moral attention, and enduring authority. Her image and actions offered reassurance amidst industrial, social, and imperial change, reminding subjects that continuity, ethical engagement, and deliberate reflection were the foundations upon which progress could be both understood and sustained. The crown, once young and tentative on the head of a sheltered princess, now rested firmly upon a sovereign whose life had spanned decades of extraordinary transformation, embodying the quiet majesty of resilience, observation, and moral constancy. As the steady pace of the 19th century drew toward its close, Britain found itself in a contemplative, almost meditative state, observing the cumulative consequences of decades of transformation. The country, once unified under the early optimism of industrial, imperial, and domestic progress, now faced a more nuanced and reflective awareness of the passage of time, the impermanence of social structures, and the subtle fading of ideals that had guided the lives of citizens for generations. Streets, factories, and villages bore the marks of both progress and enduring struggle. Railways, telegraphs, and mechanized systems had altered perception of space and time, while social reforms and educational expansion had reshaped the ethical consciousness of the populace. In this period of quiet reflection, the rhythms of life slowed slightly, allowing citizens and observers alike to take stock of achievements, shortcomings, and the inevitability of change. Industrial landscapes, once dominated by the unrelenting energy of expansion, now bore the soft patina of familiarity. Factories continued to hum, locomotives coursed along rails with methodical precision, and cities glimmered with electric and gaslight. Yet the novelty of these innovations had given way to contemplation. Workers, managers, and engineers were acutely aware of both the comforts and the moral responsibilities that accompanied technological mastery. Safety standards, labor regulations, and public hygiene had gradually improved, though the echoes of earlier struggles lingered in stories of hardship, labor disputes, and local hardship. In this way, the material and social environment reflected a century's worth of adaptation, moral consideration, and practical reflection, blending accomplishment with awareness of imperfection. Socially, the population continued to navigate the subtle evolution of class, gender, and civic engagement. The working class, long subjected to arduous conditions, now participated more fully in political life through suffrage extensions, educational opportunity, and organized labor advocacy. The middle and upper classes, guardians of domestic and civic morality, observed the benefits and consequences of industrial, educational, and social reform. Women, increasingly educated and engaged in professional, charitable, and civic endeavors, continued to negotiate the balance between traditional domesticity and emerging public roles. Across these groups, society moved with deliberate awareness, integrating change into established rhythms rather than experiencing abrupt disruption, reflecting the Victorian ideal of measured moral and social engagement. Imperial considerations, too, occupied reflective attention. The colonies and dominions that had been central to Britain's global confidence were now understood in more complex terms. Economic benefits were balanced against the ethical implications of governance, cultural disruption, and human cost. Administrators, policymakers, and citizens alike considered the legacy of expansion, weighing the enduring infrastructure, education, and communication networks against the social, cultural, and environmental transformations imposed on colonial societies. These reflections did not produce immediate upheaval, but they fostered a moral and historical awareness that quietly shaped discourse, policy, and popular perception, reinforcing the idea that responsibility must accompany influence. Literature and the arts offered further means of contemplation, providing mirrors in which society could observe its own evolution. Writers, poets, and critics chronicled the nuances of urban and rural life, industrial transformation, domestic experience, and moral reflection, blending description, narrative, and philosophical insight. Citizens, in reading serialized novels, essays, and poetry, were invited into prolonged reflection on their own society, empathizing with distant experiences while considering the moral implications of technological, social, and imperial change. This literary dialogue, integrated into domestic routines and public discourse, reinforced the contemplative mood of the century's twilight, reminding observers that progress carried both achievement and ethical responsibility. Science and invention, once sources of rapid excitement and practical intervention, had settled into a rhythm of integration. Electrical systems illuminated homes and streets, telegraphs and telephones connected communities across distances, and public health initiatives, sanitation projects and industrial safety measures became standard practice rather than novelty. Citizens and administrators understood the dual nature of innovation. It was both a tool for comfort and a challenge to conscience, requiring ongoing attention to equitable application, ethical oversight, and practical maintenance. Reflection on these developments was deliberate and pervasive, underscoring the Victorian pattern of thoughtful engagement with the material and social world. Within the monarchy, Queen Victoria's presence, though diminished by age, continued to symbolize continuity and reflection. Her later years were marked by contemplation of both personal experience and national evolution, observing with careful attention the interplay of industrial growth, imperial expansion, social reform, and cultural transformation. The Queen's influence remained moral, symbolic, and practical, shaping public perception, reinforcing civic awareness, and reminding citizens that longevity, ethical engagement, and reflective authority were essential counterbalances to rapid societal change. Her image, seen on coins, in portraits, and in ceremonial spaces, became a touchstone of stability amidst the subtle transformations of society and the approaching dawn of a new century. The closing years of the century also carried an awareness of transition beyond Britain's shores. European and global powers, including Germany, the United States, and Japan, were emerging with technological, industrial, and military capabilities that challenged Britain's preeminence. Observers, both in the government and the general populace, reflected on the implications of shifting international balance, considering how domestic stability, ethical governance, and continued adaptation would influence Britain's role in a rapidly evolving world. This contemplative stance, rather than provoking panic or dramatic action, encouraged measured observation, cautious planning, and moral attention to the responsibilities inherent in power, echoing the broader ethos of the Victorian age. Culturally, citizens observed the subtle fading of long-standing values alongside the persistence of others. Piety, propriety, and domestic morality remained influential, yet emerging ideas, artistic movements, and philosophical debates suggested shifts in taste, expectation, and reflection. The interplay of continuity and evolution was evident in domestic routines, educational curricula, literary output, and social practice, reinforcing the notion that even the most enduring ideals required adaptation, observation, and reflection to remain meaningful in a changing world. Ultimately, the twilight of the Victorian century was marked by quiet contemplation, measured reflection, and awareness of transition. Citizens, administrators, and the monarchy alike recognized the passage of decades, the cumulative consequences of reform, invention, and empire, and the subtle emergence of new challenges and possibilities. The closing years invited the nation to pause, to observe, and to internalize lessons learned from the interplay of progress, moral responsibility, and social continuity, fostering a sense of historical consciousness that was both calm and profound. In this reflective dusk, Britain approached the threshold of a new era, poised between continuity and change, observation and action, achievement and ethical responsibility. The century's conclusion was neither abrupt nor sensational. It was a measured recognition of the rhythms of time, the persistence of human endeavor, and the enduring necessity of reflection and conscience amidst the unfolding narrative of society. Citizens, accustomed to careful attention to progress, governance, and moral principle, were prepared to carry these lessons forward, maintaining the Victorian commitment to observation, ethical engagement, and deliberate participation in both domestic and global life. As the final years of the 19th century gave way to the opening of a new century, Britain moved toward a profound moment of quiet transition, one that would mark both personal loss and the symbolic closing of an era. The life of Queen Victoria, spanning over 80 years and 63 of them upon the throne, had been a steady witness to industrial revolution, social reform, imperial expansion, and cultural flowering. Her death in January of 1901 was neither sudden nor violent. It arrived with the calm inevitability of a long day's end, the slow fading of light, and the gentle stillness that accompanies reflection upon decades of continuous observation and conscientious engagement. Yet in its quietness lay a resonance that extended far beyond the walls of royal palaces, touching every layer of British life, every colonial outpost, and every individual who had lived, laboured, or observed within the rhythms of the Victorian age. The Queen's passing was accompanied by ceremonial solemnity, an orchestration of mourning that reflected both the magnitude of her personal life and the symbolic weight of her reign. Across London and other major cities, flags were lowered, bells tolled, and the streets bore the soft movement of citizens assembled to observe their sovereign's departure. The scale of grief, though profound, was tempered by the Victorian ethic of reflection, restraint, and moral contemplation. Citizens experienced the loss not in sudden turmoil, but in deliberate communal acknowledgement, recognizing that the monarch who had guided the nation through decades of transformation was now at rest. Her life and reign, both a personal narrative and a public symbol of stability and continuity. Within the royal household, mourning unfolded with meticulous attention to tradition, propriety and ritual. Black attire, subdued ceremonies, and the slow progression of funeral preparations reflected the integration of personal grief with civic expectation. Household routines, once dominated by ceremonial and administrative rhythms, adapted to the absence of the central figure whose presence had infused daily life with order and measured authority. Staff, attendants, and family members observed strict patterns of decorum, balancing private sorrow with the maintenance of the ceremonial and institutional frameworks that had supported the monarchy across decades. The funeral itself, an elaborate yet restrained orchestration of public and private observance, reflected the duality that had characterized Victoria's life and reign, personal devotion intertwined with civic symbolism. Processions moved with deliberate pacing, the movement of carriages, soldiers and ceremonial attendants forming a measured rhythm that echoed the steady flow of decades past. Crowds lining the streets maintained a respectful silence, acknowledging the passage of both a sovereign and an era, while distant observers, in colonial cities and provinces, received word through telegrams, letters, and newspapers, experiencing a simultaneous sense of personal and national reflection. Beyond the immediate rituals of death, Victoria's passing signaled the symbolic end of a world carefully shaped by the rhythms of observation, ethical engagement, and measured innovation. Gaslight, once the glow that had illuminated streets, homes, and factories, was increasingly replaced by electricity, its quiet flicker marking both technical advancement and the passage of time. The empire, vast and meticulously organized, faced new challenges and uncertainties, as emerging powers on the global stage altered the balance of influence, commerce and diplomacy. Social, cultural and technological structures, once framed by Victorian propriety, morality, and innovation, now intersected with forces of modernity that would accelerate change in ways both exhilarating and disquieting. In literature, art, and public discourse, the Queen's death became a lens through which reflection upon the century was organized. Writers chronicled the accomplishments, missteps, and ethical deliberations that had characterized her reign, weaving together narratives of industrial transformation, social reform, imperial expansion, and cultural achievement. Citizens absorbed these reflections in domestic spaces, libraries, and public forums, engaging in quiet contemplation of the lessons, challenges, and rhythms that had defined the era. Through this engagement, the Victorian ethos of moral responsibility, measured innovation, and reflective observation was transmitted into memory, guiding interpretation of both past achievement and future possibility. Colonial outposts, connected to London by telegraph, mail, and administrative networks, observed the transition with their own reflective rituals. Administrators, officials, and local populations considered the implications of the monarch's passing for imperial governance, recognizing both continuity and potential change in the administration of distant territories. The rhythms of commerce, governance, and cultural exchange continued, yet they were now accompanied by the awareness that the symbolic anchor of the era, The sovereign whose presence had unified distant lands and peoples was no longer physically present, leaving behind an ethical, political, and cultural framework to be interpreted, maintained, and adapted by successive generations. At the heart of these reflections lay the quiet acknowledgement of human mortality alongside historical continuity. The monarch's death served as both a personal event and a societal mirror, reminding citizens that all institutions, achievements, and structures, no matter how enduring, are framed by the passage of time. Yet the careful cultivation of responsibility, moral awareness, and reflective governance throughout her reign provided a model for continuity, resilience, and thoughtful adaptation, demonstrating that even as the old world faded, the lessons, patterns, and principles it embodied could endure in the fabric of society. The cultural and technological transitions occurring at this juncture further amplified the symbolic resonance of the Queen's passing. Steam and steel, telegraph and electricity, industrial labor and domestic reform, all were woven into a tapestry of achievement and reflection, carrying the memory of decades past into a world poised for transformation. Citizens, writers, and policymakers engaged with these changes contemplatively, integrating them into daily life while remaining aware of both ethical responsibility and historical precedent. In this way, the Victorian emphasis on measured progress, moral attention, and reflective observation persisted, even as the century concluded and modernity began to accelerate. Ultimately, the death of Queen Victoria represented more than the end of a life. It signified the closure of a cultural, technological, and moral epoch. The transition from gaslight to electricity, from cautious imperial expansion to global competition, and from rigid social norms to emerging modern sensibilities mirrored the broader evolution of the nation itself. Yet the deliberate rhythms, ethical engagement, and reflective observation that characterized her reign remained embedded in the structures, practices, and consciousness of society, providing a bridge between past and future, continuity and innovation. In the slow fading of this era, the nation observed, reflected, and internalized the cumulative experiences of decades, the quiet triumphs of moral and social reform, the achievements and consequences of empire, the innovations of industry and science, and the enduring rhythms of domestic and public life. The Victorian age, defined by a balance of conscience, progress, and reflective stability, left an imprint on every corner of society, an echo of order and moral engagement that would resonate even as the modern world accelerated around it. In the final moments, as the sovereign's life concluded and the century gave way to the next, Britain and its people paused in quiet contemplation, honoring an era whose lessons, rhythms, and legacy would endure far beyond the moment of its passing. The curtain fell gently, yet indelibly, upon the long shadow of the Victorian age, leaving a world transformed by industry, literature, social reform, empire, and reflection, poised on the threshold of the 20th century, carrying forward both the accomplishments and the contemplations of an epoch that had been as measured as it had been profound.